Hey guys, tonight we begin with the slow crackle of a hearth while rain taps softly against old stone walls. So dim the lights if you can. Find a comfortable place to settle down. Pull a blanket over yourself. Let your shoulders relax. There is nowhere to rush tonight. No dramatic cliffhangers. No heroic speeches. Just a long, slow wander through history, where kings worried about damp socks, queens caught endless colds, servants argued over firewood, and entire kingdoms somehow depended on people who could barely manage their own breakfast. Take a slow breath and imagine the sound of rain falling outside a medieval castle. The fire pops every few moments. Somewhere a sleepy dog sighs. A candle flickers because apparently medieval windows believed keeping drafts outside was more of a suggestion than an actual responsibility. Tonight, we're simply sitting near the warmth, watching history drift by one royal family at a time. Because history, despite what movies insist, was often surprisingly slow. Bureaucracy existed. Waiting existed. Damp clothing existed. Those three things alone probably occupied half of medieval life. The rain begins before sunrise. Not dramatically, not with thunder that shakes the heavens. Just a patient drizzle that seems perfectly content to continue for the next 3 days. For the people inside a medieval castle, this is less an inconvenience and more an accepted feature of existence. Stone walls slowly absorb moisture. Wooden beams creak quietly. The smell of smoke mixes with wet earth. Every cloak hanging near the entrance feels just a little heavier than yesterday. And somewhere in the great hall, servants are already awake. Not because they enjoy mornings. Absolutely nobody enjoys medieval mornings. They're awake because somebody has to convince a stubborn fire to come back to life after spending the night trying very hard to become a disappointing pile of gray ash. It sounds simple. Add wood. Light fire. Enjoy warmth. Reality naturally disagrees. The previous evening's embers have to be carefully uncovered. Dry kindling must be found. Hopefully dry. Sometimes dry simply means less wet than everything else. A servant crouches beside the hearth, blowing carefully into glowing coals. Another brings bundles of split oak. Someone else accidentally fills the room with smoke. Again, because chimneys during the Middle Ages were wonderful inventions in theory. In practice, well, let's just say medieval architecture occasionally believed smoke should develop its own opinions about where to travel. Eventually the flames return. Slowly, patiently, orange light spreads across the hall. People drift toward it almost automatically. Heat is valuable. Comfort is valuable. And in Northern Europe during a rainy autumn morning, they are practically priceless. Modern people often imagine castles as magnificent homes, huge towers, great banners, endless feasts, polished armor, very cinematic. The reality was somewhat damper. Castles were built for defense first. Comfort arrived centuries later, looked around, noticed the draft, and quietly left again. Stone holds cold remarkably well. It also shares that cold with everyone nearby. Even wealthy nobles often spent much of winter wrapped in layers upon layers of wool. Not because fashion demanded it, because freezing slowly is apparently less unpleasant than freezing quickly. The great hearth became the emotional center of the household. People gathered around it to eat, to talk, to sew, to mend clothing, to discuss taxes. Unfortunately, History has a surprising amount of taxes. Even bedtime often happened within sight of the fire. Warmth wasn't evenly distributed throughout the building. If you wandered into distant hallways during winter, congratulations. You had voluntarily entered nature's refrigerator. The king himself might own dozens of rooms. He probably preferred whichever one had the largest fireplace. Because crowns are impressive, hypothermia remains unconvinced. One royal household after another learned this lesson. The kings of England certainly did. So did the kings of France. The Holy Roman emperors managed entire continents while simultaneously struggling to keep castles warm enough that everyone stopped complaining. Spoiler: they rarely succeeded. Let's drift gently toward one particularly familiar royal family. Not because they were the most powerful. History enjoys changing its mind about that every few decades. But because they left behind wonderfully ordinary details. The English Plantagenets. Now, the Plantagenets are usually remembered for wars. Civil wars, French wars, family arguments that somehow became international incidents. Because apparently medieval diplomacy often resembled Thanksgiving dinner if everyone owned cavalry. Yet inside their castles, daily life moved surprisingly quietly. Breakfast arrived. Letters arrived. Rain arrived. Rain always arrived. Servants recorded purchases with careful handwriting. Salt, candles, firewood, more firewood, an unreasonable amount of firewood. Heating enormous buildings required astonishing quantities of timber. Entire forests slowly disappeared into fireplaces. Not because people were wasteful, because winter politely refused to negotiate. The royal household employed officials whose entire careers revolved around obtaining fuel. Imagine introducing yourself. What do you do for His Majesty? I buy logs. And mostly logs. Honestly, that job probably mattered more than several nobles. Without fuel, the king shivered. If the king shivered, everyone noticed. Medieval government occasionally functioned on surprisingly practical foundations. Meanwhile, rain continued tapping softly against leaded glass. Windows remained small. Glass remained expensive. Many openings were covered by shutters instead. Light inside remained dim even during daytime. Candles filled the darkness. Tallow candles smelled memorable. Beeswax candles smelled considerably nicer. Guess which ones wealthy households preferred. Exactly. Money improves many experiences, including how pleasant your lighting smells. The fire crackles again. Someone turns a roasting spit. Another servant carries fresh bread. Dogs wait patiently beneath the tables, displaying the remarkable optimism common to all dogs throughout history. Perhaps something delicious will fall. Perhaps today is the day. Hope survives. One crumb at a time. Kings often hunted. Queens often managed complicated households. Children learned manners, or failed to. History contains no shortage of spoiled princes. One of the most fascinating parts of royal life is how strangely ordinary many daily frustrations remained. A leaking roof still leaked. A sore tooth still hurt. A cold remained miserable. No amount of embroidered velvet convinced influenza to behave respectfully. Even famous monarchs spent weeks coughing beside fireplaces. Doctors recommended fascinating treatments. Some involved herbs. Some involved bleeding patients. Some probably made everybody involved question their career choices. Medicine remained enthusiastic. Accuracy arrived somewhat later. Let's ease into another quiet corner of medieval life. Sleeping. Modern bedrooms prioritize comfort. Medieval sleeping arrangements prioritized flexibility. Royal courts traveled constantly. Entire households packed belongings and moved from castle to castle. Not because vacations sounded appealing, because maintaining authority required appearing in person. The king essentially became a traveling government office. Along came servants, furniture, documents, clothing, kitchen equipment, priests, musicians, dogs, probably several people whose exact purpose nobody remembered anymore, but who continued receiving meals anyway. Every destination required fires, beds, fresh straw, cooking, organization. Rain complicated everything. Mud complicated everything even more. Roads became slippery. Wagons struggled. Horses complained in the only language horses possess. Entire journeys slowed dramatically. Nobody invented shock absorbers yet. Travel therefore resembled spending several days inside an aggressively shaking wooden box. The nobility accepted this because they lacked alternatives. Comfort occasionally waved from the future. It would eventually arrive. Several centuries late. Inside castles, tapestries decorated walls. Modern visitors admire their beauty. Contemporaries admired something else. Insulation. Large woven fabrics trapped warmth. Even art had practical responsibilities. Paintings impressed guests. Tapestries quietly fought winter. An unsung hero, really. The hearth remained undefeated. Everyone returned there. Stories unfolded nearby. Children played nearby. Important political discussions happened nearby. One ambassador might negotiate the fate of provinces while absent-mindedly warming cold hands. History sometimes changes course because everyone preferred standing near the warm side of the room. Human beings remain remarkably consistent. Let's float gently toward France. Rain falls there too, despite national reputations for elegance. Medieval French castles also smelled faintly of smoke. Royal households there managed enormous kitchens. Bread ovens glowed from dawn onward. Cooks supervised dozens of assistants. Meals for aristocratic courts became elaborate performances. Not necessarily because everyone enjoyed luxury. Status required visibility. The more dishes served, the greater the prestige. Of course, somebody had to prepare everything. Kitchen work remained exhausting. Hot, dangerous, busy beyond imagination. Imagine roasting multiple animals over open fires while nobles complained dinner seemed slightly delayed. Customer satisfaction has always been challenging. Meanwhile, upstairs, noble ladies embroidered quietly beside fireplaces. Conversation drifted from family gossip to marriage negotiations. Royal marriages, of course, rarely involved romance. They involved treaties, land, alliances, inheritance, and occasionally cousins marrying cousins because apparently Europe looked at an extremely limited dating pool and declared, "This seems perfectly reasonable." Future generations would gently disagree, but we'll save that wonderfully tangled family tree for another evening. For now, rain continues outside. The fire continues inside. Servants replace another log. The room grows warmer. Someone yawns. Even kings yawned. History politely forgets to mention that. It also forgets that royal paperwork could become astonishingly dull. Land grants, tax records, lists of supplies, letters requesting more supplies, letters apologizing that supplies had not yet arrived. Entire archives survive largely because medieval administrators possessed heroic patience. Without them, historians today would know considerably less. So here's a quiet thank you to anonymous clerks. Your handwriting survived. Our eyesight may not, but your effort mattered. The hours pass slowly. Outside, rain continues without urgency. Inside, conversations become softer. Children grow sleepy. Musicians play gentle melodies. Someone quietly repairs a cloak near the fire. Another polishes riding boots. Ordinary moments, tiny moments, the sort history books often ignore. Yet these moments filled most of every life, even royal life, especially royal life, because despite crowns and ceremonies and magnificent titles stretching halfway across Europe, everyone still waited for wet boots to dry beside the same crackling hearth. And somehow, that humble fire connected peasants and princes alike. One warmed rough working hands. The other warmed jeweled fingers. The flames never cared which was which. They simply burned. Steadily, patiently. By now, the fire has settled into a steady rhythm. The louder crackles have faded. Only the occasional pop interrupts the quiet. Outside, the rain has no intention of stopping. It has settled into that patient medieval drizzle that seems less like weather and more like a permanent personality trait. If castles had neighbors, this rain would probably borrow flour, stay for dinner, and then refuse to leave until spring. So settle in a little deeper. Pull the blanket just a bit higher. Our journey continues, not toward great battles, not toward dramatic betrayals. Tonight, we're following damp footprints across stone floors, listening to sleepy conversations echo beneath wooden beams, and discovering that even Europe's grandest castles often felt like enormous houses where absolutely nobody could find a dry pair of boots. One of the biggest surprises for modern visitors is how loud medieval castles actually were. Not constantly, but unpredictably. Stone carries sound remarkably well. A servant dropping a bucket in the courtyard might be heard 3 floors above. A barking dog could echo through several hallways. Someone shutting a heavy oak door often sounded as though the building itself had decided to sneeze. Privacy existed, just not very much of it. Royal apartments offered some separation, but walls remained thick primarily for defense, not for silence. Ironically, thick stone reflected sound in peculiar ways. A whispered conversation near one staircase could travel farther than expected. Meanwhile, someone shouting across the courtyard somehow remained impossible to understand. Architecture has always enjoyed keeping people humble. As the household slowly woke, the castle developed its own rhythm. Kitchen fires burned first, then the bakery, then the smithy if repairs were needed. Stable boys hurried through the drizzle before sunrise. Horses, unlike kings, expected breakfast exactly on time. They possessed very little patience for royal scheduling. Somewhere nearby, chickens protested absolutely everything. Fortunately, chickens have remained remarkably consistent throughout history. A rooster in the year 1275 behaved almost exactly like one today. Loud, confident, usually convinced everyone else needed to wake up immediately. Nobody had informed the rooster that the king had gone to bed late after discussing border disputes. The rooster simply carried on. Royal authority ended where poultry began. The castle kitchens soon filled with familiar smells. Fresh bread, porridge, onions sizzling in animal fat, occasionally herbs from the garden. Not exotic spices every morning. Those remained expensive luxuries. Hollywood sometimes imagines medieval nobles eating endless feasts every single day. Reality preferred repetition. Bread appeared constantly. Ale appeared constantly. Cheese appeared constantly. Stew appeared with almost suspicious frequency. People learned to become wonderfully creative with stew. Yesterday's leftovers became today's lunch. Today's leftovers became tomorrow's thicker stew. Eventually, ingredients reached a point where nobody remembered exactly when they first entered the pot. Hopefully before last Tuesday. The cooks preferred not to investigate too closely. One massive cooking cauldron might feed dozens or even hundreds of people. Everything depended upon the size of the household. Kings traveled with astonishing numbers of attendants. Even minor nobles employed enough servants to keep kitchens busy from dawn until well after sunset. Cooking over open fires demanded patience. There were no temperature settings, no timers, no little digital screens cheerfully announcing that dinner would be ready in 19 minutes. Instead, there was experience. A cook learned how close to place a pot, how hot the coals should feel, how quickly the fire consumed oak instead of ash. Generations passed these skills quietly from one cook to another. Nobody called it culinary science. It simply became survival. Meanwhile, the king finally wakes. Probably. Medieval mornings rarely began at exactly the same hour. Without modern schedules, life followed daylight more than clocks. Mechanical clocks certainly existed by the later Middle Ages, but most people still relied upon church bells, sunrise, habit, and occasionally one particularly enthusiastic rooster. The royal chamber remained noticeably warmer than much of the castle. Not warm by modern standards, simply less cold. Heavy curtains surrounded the bed. Large fireplaces burned for hours before anyone important emerged. Servants quietly entered first. Fresh clothing waited nearby. Water for washing had been warmed. Hopefully. Warm water represented one of those luxuries people appreciated without necessarily discussing. Cold water certainly encouraged alertness. Perhaps more alertness than anyone requested. The king dressed layer upon layer. Linen beneath, wool above, perhaps fur during winter. Royal portraits often make medieval rulers appear effortlessly magnificent. Portraits rarely include the practical reality that they were essentially wearing enough fabric to survive living inside an oversized stone refrigerator. Fashion occasionally surrendered to physics. The Queen's mourning followed similar routines. Ladies-in-waiting helped arrange clothing. Hair demanded attention. Jewelry appeared according to the day's obligations. Court etiquette required astonishing amounts of preparation. Looking effortlessly elegant often involved several other people working extremely hard. A lesson that has survived remarkably well into modern celebrity culture. Once dressed, the royal family attended religious services. This happened frequently, sometimes daily. Faith occupied every corner of medieval society. Church bells measured time. Religious festivals organized the calendar. Monasteries preserved knowledge. Priests recorded births, deaths, marriages, and occasionally local gossip disguised as official records. The chapel inside a castle became one of its quietest spaces. Candles flickered softly. Voices lowered almost automatically. Rain tapped gently against narrow windows. For a few moments, even politics paused. Not permanently. Politics has extraordinary stamina. But briefly, after prayers came work. Kings rarely spent every day issuing grand proclamations. Instead, they read letters, met advisors, reviewed legal disputes, approved expenses, discussed harvests, listened to complaints, answered more letters. The surprising amount of paperwork behind medieval government continues to amaze historians. Entire wagons transported documents. Clerks copied everything carefully by hand. Ink-stained fingers. Parchment remained expensive. Mistakes proved frustrating. Imagine writing an elegant official letter for 3 hours before discovering one unfortunate spelling error halfway down the page. The temptation to sigh must have been overwhelming. Let's drift quietly toward another fireplace. This one belongs not to the king but to the castle steward, an enormously important official whom most people have never heard of. History often remembers monarchs. Stewards quietly made sure monarchs actually had functioning households. Food arrived because of them. Supplies arrived because of them. Repairs happened because of them, or didn't happen, which usually produced lengthy complaints. The steward inspected inventories. How much grain remained? How many barrels of ale? Enough candles for winter? Enough salted meat? Enough oats for horses? Administration rarely appears in adventure films. Yet entire kingdoms depended upon competent managers. Without organization, castles became expensive collections of damp stone. Outside, rainwater collected in muddy courtyards. Children ignored the mud. Children throughout history have consistently viewed mud not as an obstacle but as an exciting opportunity. Parents throughout history have consistently disagreed. Servants swept endlessly. Straw covered particularly messy pathways. Boots still returned indoors carrying astonishing amounts of dirt. Keeping a medieval castle clean resembled attempting to dry the ocean using towels. Nobody truly expected victory, only gradual improvement. Dogs wandered freely. Cats performed valuable work catching mice. Unlike modern pets, castle animals often held actual job descriptions. The cats guarded grain supplies. The dogs guarded people. Geese surprisingly guarded almost everything else. Geese possess deeply held opinions regarding strangers. Anyone who has encountered an angry goose understands exactly why some estates trusted them almost as much as watchmen. Perhaps even more. They certainly complained louder. Afternoon settled gently across the castle. The rain softened, then strengthened again. Clouds drifted low over forests surrounding the walls. Smoke curled upward from chimneys before disappearing into gray skies. Travelers approaching from distant roads likely appeared soaked from head to toe. Hospitality became essential. Guests received warm food, fresh straw, dry clothing whenever possible. Medieval travel remained exhausting. Roads varied enormously. Bridges occasionally disappeared. Flooded rivers politely informed travelers to wait several days. Nobody enjoyed sleeping outdoors during relentless rain. Even wealthy merchants sometimes arrived looking less like successful businessmen and more like damp bundles wrapped in expensive fabric. As evening approached, candles multiplied. Darkness arrived quickly inside thick stone buildings. Light remained precious. Beeswax candles burned brighter and cleaner. Tallow candles smoked more. People accepted whichever option their finances permitted. One by one, flames appeared throughout the hall. Each tiny light pushed darkness back only a little. Together they transformed the room. The fire once again became everyone's destination. Stories returned. Music returned. Needlework returned. Someone quietly carved wood beside the hearth. Another carefully repaired leather belts. Children slowly nodded off despite trying very hard to stay awake. A nobleman began explaining an incredibly long hunting story. Again, everyone had heard it before. He insisted this version contained important new details. It did not. History is wonderfully full of people repeating the same stories around warm fires. Some traditions never disappear. The rain eased at last. Only scattered drops remained. The smell of wet earth drifted through the courtyard. Somewhere an owl called softly beyond the walls. The castle itself seemed to exhale. Another ordinary day had quietly passed. No famous treaty had been signed. No legendary battle fought. No crown gained or lost. Just meals served. Letters written. Logs burned. Boots dried. Children laughed. Servants worked. Kings worried. Queens planned. And hundreds of ordinary moments stitched together another peaceful day in the long fabric of medieval life. Tomorrow the rain might return. Honestly, probably would. But the hearth would be waiting. Someone would coax sleeping embers back into flame. Someone would carry another armful of oak. Someone would complain that the chimney smoked too much. Someone else would insist it had always smoked like that. The fire would crackle. The hall would slowly warm. The rain has finally slowed, not stopped. It simply seems a little less determined than before. Instead of a steady curtain of water, only scattered drops tap against the roof. Every now and then a breeze nudges a few droplets from the castle walls, and they splash softly into puddles that have been patiently collecting all afternoon. Inside, the hearth has become the unquestioned ruler of the evening. Nobody argues with the hearth. Provides warmth. It dries wet cloaks. Cooks supper. It gives enough light that people don't accidentally walk into pillars. Honestly, it was probably more useful than quite a few medieval dukes. So, let your mind drift with the fire. Imagine the orange glow stretching across the stone floor. Imagine the gentle smell of oak smoke. Imagine that somewhere outside, beyond the walls, the forest is settling down for the night. Evening transformed a medieval castle in subtle ways. During daylight, servants hurried everywhere. Buckets sloshed. Doors opened and closed. Messengers arrived covered in road dust. Blacksmiths hammered iron until the courtyard echoed. Stable boys hurried between horses. Kitchen workers shouted across steaming pots. Everything moved with purpose. Then sunset arrived. Not suddenly, just gradually. The pace softened. Voices became quieter. The day's work slowly folded itself away. This was not because everyone suddenly became relaxed. Far from it. Tomorrow's work already waited patiently. But there was little point beginning another major task once darkness settled across the countryside. Candles were expensive. Firelight reached only so far. People accepted that night belonged to rest, or at least to slower work. One of the castle servants carefully trimmed the wick of a beeswax candle. Sounds like a tiny task. It was, yet tiny tasks filled medieval life. A candle left unattended burned poorly. Too much wick produced smoke. Too little produced weak light. Simple experience taught people how to manage these little details. Nobody wrote motivational books called 7 Habits of Highly Effective Candle Keepers. People simply learned. The hall slowly filled again. Not with excitement, with familiarity. A knight removed heavy boots that had spent the afternoon crossing muddy roads. A steward finished counting grain deliveries. 2 young pages quietly practiced reading from a Latin manuscript. One stumbled repeatedly over unfamiliar words. The older tutor corrected him with endless patience. Or perhaps practiced patience. Teachers throughout history have occasionally needed to pretend. Nearby, an elderly noblewoman continued spinning wool. She had probably done this thousands of evenings before. Her hands barely needed instructions anymore. The spinning wheel hummed softly, not loudly enough to interrupt conversation, just enough to become part of the castle's evening music. History often celebrates extraordinary inventions. The printing press, gunpowder, ocean-going ships. But there is something comforting about these ordinary tools. A spindle, a loom, a wooden spoon, objects touched by countless ordinary people who expected absolutely nobody to remember their names. Yet without them, kings would have gone hungry, queens would have gone cold, empires would have become surprisingly inconvenient places to manage. The fire shifted. Someone added another log. Tiny sparks floated upward before disappearing inside the chimney. Hopefully inside the chimney. Sometimes they wandered elsewhere. Fire remained both friend and enemy. Entire medieval cities feared accidental fires more than invading armies. An army might arrive once in a generation. Careless flames possessed a much busier schedule. Stone castles survived fires better than wooden towns. Still, everyone respected open flames. Respect usually arrived after someone had accidentally set something important on fire. Experience can be a persuasive teacher. Let's drift toward one of the castle's smaller rooms. Here sits the castle scribe. Not a glamorous position, no shining armor, no magnificent crown, just parchment, ink, feathers, and extraordinarily careful handwriting. The scribe copies a royal letter. Every word matters. Every flourish matters. Mistakes are expensive. Parchment is made from animal skin. Producing it requires time, labor, and considerable patience. Nobody wants to waste it because someone sneezed halfway through a sentence. The scribe writes slowly, steadily. Outside, rainwater slides quietly down the window. Inside, the feather scratches across parchment. That sound, scratch, pause, scratch, dip into ink, scratch again, might be one of the most peaceful sounds in medieval history. Thousands upon thousands of pages survived because anonymous scribes patiently copied documents long after everyone else had gone to sleep. Modern historians owe these people a tremendous debt, although historians occasionally wish they had written just a little more clearly. Medieval handwriting sometimes appears to have been invented specifically to challenge future researchers. Across another hallway, music begins. Nothing dramatic. Perhaps a small harp, maybe a flute, possibly a rebec, whose gentle strings carried surprisingly well through stone rooms. Professional musicians often belonged to noble households. Not every evening required entertainment, but music softened long winters. It made celebrations richer. It eased loneliness. People have always appreciated a quiet melody after a long day. Some songs celebrated famous victories. Others described impossible romances. Many simply told familiar stories everyone already knew. People listened anyway, because familiar stories become comforting companions. Rather like this one. Now let's quietly visit one of Europe's most famous kings. Not during a battle, not during a coronation. Instead, let's visit him on an ordinary rainy evening. King Edward I of England. History remembers Edward as a determined ruler, a conqueror, a builder of castles, a man who seemed permanently occupied with expanding royal authority. Perfectly respectable historical achievements. But Edward also had evenings. He also sat indoors while rain struck castle roofs. He also read reports that were probably much less exciting than modern documentaries suggest. Imagine stacks of financial accounts, livestock inventories, disputes over property boundaries, complaints from local officials, requests for additional funds. History quietly runs on paperwork. Edward's household contained hundreds of people. Each required food, clothing, fuel, payment, accommodation. Managing this traveling royal machine demanded extraordinary organization. One surviving household account lists purchases that seem surprisingly familiar. Candles, salt, cheese, firewood. Firewood appears constantly. If medieval accounting books had favorite words, firewood would rank remarkably high. Meanwhile, Queen Eleanor spent considerable time overseeing her own household. Royal women often managed enormous domestic operations. Dozens of servants answered to them. Textiles required supervision. Supplies required organization. Guests required hospitality. Children required education. Court life demanded endless coordination. The stereotype that medieval queens simply sat elegantly beside windows misses an enormous amount of daily responsibility. Administration came in many forms. Some wore crowns. The rain finally stops. Not because history commanded it, simply because weather eventually grows tired. Outside, mist rises gently above the castle walls. The air smells wonderfully fresh. A guard walks slowly along the battlements. His footsteps echo against damp stone. His shift lasts several hours, probably longer than he would prefer. Fortunately, medieval guards possessed excellent opportunities to think. Unfortunately, many of those thoughts probably involved wishing they were closer to the fireplace. Cold has an extraordinary ability to simplify priorities. Within the castle, bedtime approaches. This, however, is not the instant process modern life encourages. There are no electric lights to switch off. Instead, darkness gradually reclaims each room. One candle after another is extinguished. Servants move quietly through hallways. Some collect wooden trenchers from supper. Others bank the fires. Banking a fire meant carefully arranging hot coals beneath ashes so they might survive until morning. A successful servant saved hours of work. An unsuccessful servant created tomorrow's first unpleasant surprise. The castle slowly becomes quieter. A baby cries somewhere in the servants' quarters. Someone coughs. A dog circles 3 times before settling beside fading embers. Outside, a horse stamps softly inside the stable. Life never becomes completely silent. It simply grows gentler. The royal family retires. Bedrooms remain cool despite heavy curtains. Beds are surprisingly high from the floor, partly for status, partly because warmer air rises. Medieval people understood practical comfort remarkably well, even if they explained it differently than modern science. Mattresses might contain feathers for the wealthy, straw for everyone else. Either way, blankets became treasured possessions. Winter nights asked much of them. A servant carries a warming pan filled with hot coals. Carefully, very carefully, the metal pan slides beneath blankets to remove the night's chill before bedtime. It sounds wonderfully comfortable, provided nobody accidentally left burning coals where they definitely should not be. History occasionally reminds us that convenience and danger have long enjoyed living together. The castle sleeps, or at least attempts to. Some servants continue working. Night watches rotate. Bakers prepare tomorrow's bread before dawn. Monks in nearby monasteries rise for midnight prayers. Owls patrol nearby woods. Foxes move silently through wet grass. Stars appear where clouds finally separate. Somewhere, another traveler still searches for shelter before morning. Inside these walls, however, the day has gently ended. No great speeches, no astonishing revelations, just another quiet evening added to thousands before it. Another fire slowly fading into glowing embers. Another family, royal though they may be, settling beneath blankets while wind whispers outside old stone walls. And as the last candle disappears into darkness, history keeps breathing at its own unhurried pace. Tomorrow another fire will be lit. Another loaf will be baked. Another letter will be written. Another king will worry about taxes. Because, despite crowns, castles, and magnificent titles stretching across Europe, life was mostly made of ordinary days. The castle is asleep, or at least it is pretending to be. Complete silence almost never existed in the Middle Ages. Even now, long after the last candle has been pinched out, the building quietly continues living its own life. A timber beam settles with a soft creak. Somewhere deep inside the walls, water drips into a stone basin. A horse shifts its weight in the stable. A sleepy dog sighs without opening its eyes. Outside, the rain has finally drifted away, leaving only damp earth and cool night air behind. This is perhaps the calmest hour a medieval castle ever experiences. No messengers, no trumpets, no cooks shouting across smoky kitchens, no noblemen arguing about property lines that somehow have remained controversial since 3 generations ago. Just darkness, stone, and a handful of people who are still awake because history never completely clocks out. The night watch begins another slow circuit around the battlements. He carries a lantern whose little flame rocks gently with each careful step. His boots scrape softly across wet stone. Every few minutes he pauses. He looks across sleeping fields. He listens. Most nights he hears very little. An owl, the wind, perhaps distant sheep, maybe another guard clearing his throat somewhere along the wall. Hollywood rather enjoys imagining medieval guards constantly spotting assassins climbing towers with ropes clenched dramatically between their teeth. Reality proved considerably less theatrical. Most guards spent long hours making absolutely certain nothing happened. Success looked wonderfully boring. If nobody attacked the castle tonight, everyone had quietly done their jobs. That sort of achievement rarely receives a grand painting. Probably should. Down below, inside the stables, another servant has already begun preparing for tomorrow. The horses sleep standing up, looking remarkably peaceful, until one snores. Yes, horses snore. Quite enthusiastically, in fact. It is strangely comforting to remember that medieval kings occasionally fell asleep listening to exactly the same unexpected stable noises that modern horse owners hear today. Some experiences travel through centuries completely unchanged. The stable master moves slowly between the stalls. He checks each animal. A lame horse could delay an entire royal journey. A sick horse might interrupt trade. A missing horse would certainly produce an uncomfortable conversation before breakfast. So he checks every halter, every feed bucket, every latch, not because anyone ordered him this evening, because experience has taught him that small problems become very large ones if ignored until sunrise. History repeatedly rewards the people who quietly notice details. Let's wander gently toward the castle kitchen. The enormous room feels completely different now. Hours ago it bustled with cooks, servants, and steaming pots. Now the fires glow softly beneath thick blankets of ash. One elderly kitchen servant carefully banks the coals. She knows exactly where the hottest embers still hide. Tomorrow morning someone will uncover them again. If fortune smiles, the fire will return with only a few careful breaths. If fortune feels less cooperative, everyone begins again from scratch. Entire mornings could depend upon whether one servant judged glowing embers correctly before going to bed. Remarkable, really. Empires often rested upon surprisingly ordinary skills. Nearby hangs a collection of iron pots. Huge ones, tiny ones, each blackened by years of smoke, each carrying scratches left by cooks whose names have long disappeared. Objects often outlive people. A cooking pot might serve 3 generations. A wooden spoon, perhaps 2. A sturdy iron knife could survive even longer. The castle itself quietly collected the fingerprints of countless forgotten lives. Modern museums display crowns beneath glass. Perfectly understandable. Crowns are beautiful, but there is something equally fascinating about an old cooking ladle polished smooth by 50 years of ordinary hands. If only it could tell stories. Although, considering how many batches of cabbage stew it witnessed, perhaps its stories would become repetitive after a while. Let's quietly climb a narrow staircase. Mind your head. Medieval architects occasionally treated ceiling height as an optional luxury. The stairs spiral upward, always upward. They are worn smooth by generations of footsteps. Kings climbed them. Queens climbed them. Servants hurried up and down carrying baskets far heavier than anyone would volunteer to carry today. Those little dips in the stone? Thousands of shoes created them. History sometimes leaves its greatest marks very slowly. At the top sits a tiny room, hardly larger than a modern office. Here sleeps one of the castle clerks. His candle burned late into the evening copying legal documents. His fingers still carry faint traces of ink. His dreams, one hopes, contain considerably fewer tax records than his waking hours. Medieval literacy remained uncommon. Those who could read and write possessed valuable skills. Royal governments depended upon them. Churches depended upon them. Merchants depended upon them. Imagine spending years mastering beautiful handwriting only to discover your greatest achievement involved calculating how many barrels of salted herring arrived in March. History has a wonderfully practical sense of humor. Outside, clouds slowly begin to separate. Moonlight spills across the courtyard. Everything appears softer. The stone walls lose their harsh edges. The puddles shimmer faintly. Even the oldest towers seem almost gentle beneath silver light. It's easy to understand why medieval poets often described castles differently than soldiers did. A soldier noticed defensive walls. Poet noticed moonlight. Both were correct. The castle simply revealed different personalities depending on who happened to be looking. Meanwhile, somewhere inside the royal apartments, the king briefly wakes. Nothing dramatic. Perhaps the fire has burned lower. Perhaps the wind rattled the shutters. Perhaps he simply rolled over. Modern biographies often skip these moments entirely. They leap from battle to treaty to coronation. Yet every famous monarch spent thousands of ordinary nights exactly like this one. Sleeping, waking, listening to rain, pulling blankets a little closer. Even Charlemagne, centuries earlier, experienced quiet evenings. So did William the Conqueror. So did Philip II of France. History's largest names still lived one uneventful Tuesday at a time. Let's float over to another royal household. This time somewhere in northern France during the 13th century. The castle here feels familiar. The smells are nearly identical. Smoke, fresh rushes spread across the floor. A hint of beeswax. Damp wool drying near the hearth. Human history contains extraordinary diversity. Yet castles across medieval Europe often shared surprisingly similar routines. Morning fires, afternoon administration, evening meals, night watches, repeat, again and again. Not because people lacked imagination, because routine keeps households functioning. Especially households containing hundreds of people. Imagine trying to organize breakfast for 300 individuals without written schedules, telephones, or modern kitchens. Suddenly routine begins looking rather brilliant. In one chamber sleeps a young prince. He has no idea historians will eventually memorize his name. Tonight he dreams like any other child. Perhaps about riding horses, perhaps about dogs, perhaps about sneaking an extra honey cake before supper. Children remained delightfully ordinary despite extraordinary birthplaces. Royal tutors certainly hoped these children would become wise rulers. Children themselves usually preferred chasing puppies. Honestly, who could blame them? The puppy almost certainly offered better conversation than constitutional law. The fire downstairs finally settles into glowing red coals. The hall grows noticeably cooler. Servants sleeping nearby instinctively wrap blankets tighter around themselves. Heating an entire castle overnight would have required impossible amounts of fuel. Instead, warmth gathered around fireplaces like islands in a sea of cold stone. People adapted. Bed curtains trapped warm air. Nightcaps reduced heat loss. Yes, those funny-looking sleeping caps had a purpose. Without central heating, every little advantage mattered. Fashion once again quietly cooperated with survival. Hours drift by. The eastern horizon slowly lightens. Not enough to call it sunrise. Just enough to hint that morning has begun, considering the possibility. Birdsong arrives cautiously. One lonely chirp, then another. Soon dozens of tiny voices greet the coming day. No orchestra conductor coordinates this performance. Nature simply knows the schedule. The guards notice first. Night gives way to blue-gray dawn. Lanterns become unnecessary. They extinguish them one by one. The stable master opens great wooden doors. Cool morning air rushes inside. The horses immediately realize breakfast cannot be far away. Remarkable creatures. They possess an almost supernatural awareness of feeding times. Across the castle, another servant yawns so widely it briefly seems as though he might swallow the dawn itself. His day begins before almost everyone else's. He heads directly toward yesterday's carefully buried embers. This is the moment. Will the fire survive? He kneels, brushes away soft gray ash. There, tiny orange glow, still alive. He smiles, not triumphantly, just with quiet satisfaction. He adds dry straw, then thin twigs. He bends close. One gentle breath. Another. The glow brightens. A faint curl of smoke rises. One more careful breath. Suddenly, a tiny flame appears. Small, fragile, almost shy. Then another joins it. Within minutes, the hearth begins crackling once more. Yesterday's warmth has become today's beginning. There is something deeply comforting about that. Long before alarm clocks, long before electric kettles, long before radiators hummed inside warm homes, someone greeted each morning exactly this way, one patient breath at a time. The first fire of the day spreads through the great hall. Its light stretches across familiar stones. Soon cooks will arrive, then bakers, then servants carrying buckets, then nobles rubbing sleepy eyes, then another day of letters, meals, conversations, repairs, prayers, and ordinary routines that history rarely bothers to celebrate. Yet these quiet mornings were the foundation beneath every famous reign, every great decision, every treaty, every royal wedding, every crown. Before any of those remarkable events could happen, someone first had to light the fire. And so, with the soft crackle of fresh oak echoing through the waking castle, another medieval day begins exactly as the last one ended. Slowly, patiently, almost peacefully, the fire is alive again. It has graduated from a shy little flame into something confident enough to fill the great hall with a warm amber glow. Shadows retreat toward the corners, though they never quite disappear. Medieval castles were remarkably good at keeping little pockets of darkness tucked away behind pillars, beneath staircases, and inside alcoves that seemed specifically designed to surprise anyone walking through them before sunrise. Outside, the air still carries the smell of last night's rain. The ground sparkles with tiny drops of water. Mist drifts lazily across the fields beyond the walls. Everything feels freshly washed, except perhaps the castle itself. After centuries of smoke, soot, damp weather, and hundreds of people sharing the same building, freshly washed, wasn't exactly the phrase most visitors would have chosen. Still, morning has arrived, and mornings have a comforting habit of beginning almost exactly the same way. The first sound that truly announces the day is not conversation. It isn't footsteps. It isn't even the crackling fire. It's the church bell. Slow, measured, steady. The bell carries across fields, through forests, over streams, and into villages where farmers are only beginning to wake. Unlike today, where everyone owns a clock tucked into a pocket or resting on a bedside table, medieval people often experienced time together. The bell announced the hours. The bell marked prayer. The bell celebrated weddings. The bell mourned funerals. The bell warned of danger. It became the heartbeat of an entire community. If you closed your eyes in a medieval village, you could probably estimate the time simply by listening. There was something wonderfully communal about it. Nobody needed to check a smartwatch. The tower handled that responsibility. Inside the castle, the bell signals movement. Servants emerge from narrow sleeping quarters. Some stretch. Others immediately begin working before they have fully opened their eyes. Morning routines have always possessed a curious ability to operate almost automatically. A young kitchen apprentice carries 2 heavy buckets toward the well. His boots splash through shallow puddles. He yawns, quite impressively. If yawning had been an Olympic event, he might have earned at least a respectable bronze medal. The well sits in the courtyard. Water reflects the pale morning sky. Drawing water requires effort. No simple twist of a faucet. No convenient plumbing. Just rope, wood, muscle, and patience. Every bucket carried indoors represents someone's labor. It's one of those details modern life quietly hides from us. Clean water appears with almost magical convenience today. For most of history, obtaining it occupied a significant portion of every single day. The apprentice returns, arms already aching. He's hardly alone. Throughout Europe, countless young servants perform almost identical tasks this very morning. Some in England, some in France, some within German castles, some inside monasteries nestled between distant hills. Different kingdoms, different rulers, remarkably similar mornings. The kitchen awakens next. The head cook arrives before nearly everyone else. He surveys yesterday's supplies: bread, salted fish, cheese, eggs, barrels of ale, sacks of oats, onions, more onions. History quietly reveals that medieval cooks had a deeply committed relationship with onions. They appeared almost everywhere. Reliable, affordable, easy to store. Not particularly glamorous, but neither are roof tiles, and nobody complains when they successfully keep rain outside. Soon knives begin chopping vegetables. Not hurriedly, rhythmically. Tap, tap, tap. The sound joins dozens of others slowly filling the room. Wood splitting, water boiling, metal scraping against stone. The castle gradually assembles its daily orchestra. No conductor required. Each person simply knows their part. Meanwhile, the bakery grows warm enough that cool morning air fogs slightly near the doorway. Fresh loaves enter the ovens. The smell begins drifting through nearby hallways. Warm bread possesses extraordinary persuasive powers. It encourages people out of bed remarkably efficiently. Even kings rarely ignored fresh bread. One cannot blame them. Some pleasures remain timeless. Elsewhere, In the royal apartments, another servant quietly opens heavy wooden shutters. Morning light spills across the room. The king stirs, not immediately, just enough to acknowledge that daylight has arrived. Unlike many modern people, medieval nobles often rose with the sun. Artificial light remained expensive. There was little advantage in sleeping through valuable daylight. Besides, government waited patiently. Governments have always excelled at waiting. Eventually, the king sits upright. Another day begins. Not a legendary day, just Tuesday, or perhaps Thursday. Medieval calendars occasionally feel less concerned with weekdays than with feast days and saints' celebrations anyway. Either way, breakfast approaches. Now, breakfast during the Middle Ages was usually simpler than dinner. Bread remained central. Ale often appeared surprisingly early by modern standards. Not because everyone wished to begin the day celebrating. Rather because weak ale was generally safer to drink than questionable water in many places. It contained relatively little alcohol. Think of it more as a dependable daily beverage than a morning party. Cheese, porridge, eggs when available, perhaps smoked fish, honey if fortune smiled. Simple food, filling food. Food intended to carry people through hours of work. Let's quietly visit another famous royal. This time, King Louis IX of France. Later generations remembered him as Saint Louis, a deeply religious monarch. Patient, thoughtful, far calmer than many rulers surrounding him. Louis preferred relatively modest habits compared with some contemporaries. He attended religious services regularly. He listened carefully to petitions. He tried, sometimes successfully, to present himself as a just ruler. Even so, Louis remained a medieval king. His household still required enormous organization. Hundreds of servants, countless supplies, a constant flow of merchants, officials, craftsmen, and visitors. One person's breakfast depended upon another person's inventory records. History quietly connects everyone. As Louis eats, nearby officials begin presenting reports. Perhaps grain prices have changed. Perhaps a bridge requires repairs. Perhaps a noble family argues over inheritance once again. Inheritance disputes appear with astonishing enthusiasm throughout medieval history. Entire generations seemed unable to agree whose field belonged to whom. Lawyers, had they existed in modern numbers, would probably have enjoyed extraordinary business opportunities. Back in the Great Hall, ordinary members of the household eat separately. Hierarchy shaped almost everything. Who sat where? Who ate first? Who received which portion? Even seating arrangements reflected social order. The closer one sat to the Lord's table, generally speaking, the higher one's status. Politics occasionally unfolded through dinner placement. Imagine discovering your chair had quietly moved 3 places farther away. No official announcement required. The furniture had already delivered the message. The dogs naturally cared very little for hierarchy. They wandered hopefully beneath every table with equal optimism. Perhaps someone would drop a crust of bread. Perhaps a piece of roasted meat. Perhaps an inattentive child might accidentally become extraordinarily generous. Hope remained alive. Tail wagging helped. Cats conducted their own morning patrols. Granaries attracted mice. Mice attracted cats. Cats considered this arrangement perfectly satisfactory. Unlike dogs, Cats generally behaved as though humans merely happened to occupy buildings originally intended for feline supervision. Some traditions stretch remarkably far across history. Outside the walls, village life has begun in earnest. Smoke rises from cottages. Farmers lead oxen toward fields. Children gather firewood. Blacksmiths reopen workshops. Merchants prepare wagons. Life beyond the castle remains closely connected to life within it. The castle offers protection. The surrounding villages provide food, labor, taxes, and trade. Neither functions especially well without the other. The relationship isn't always peaceful. Taxes rarely inspire universal applause. Yet together they create the everyday rhythm of medieval society. As the morning advances, sunlight slowly dries the courtyard stones. Yesterday's puddles shrink. Sparrows hop confidently across patches of grass. A pair of ravens settle atop one of the towers. Ravens fascinated medieval people, sometimes admired, sometimes feared, sometimes viewed as messengers of fortune. Mostly, they behaved exactly like clever birds looking for breakfast. History occasionally gives animals reputations they never requested. A messenger finally arrives. His horse breathes heavily after several miles on muddy roads. His cloak still carries tiny droplets from earlier rain. He bows, produces a sealed letter. Immediately, the castle changes pace ever so slightly. Letters matter. Information travels only as fast as people or horses. A message delayed by storms might arrive days late. A broken bridge might postpone news for an entire week. Patience remained an unavoidable part of politics. Imagine waiting 10 days simply to learn whether someone had accepted your invitation. Modern email has perhaps spoiled us just a little. The steward accepts the letter. A clerk breaks the seal carefully. Ink, wax, parchment. These ordinary materials quietly connect kingdoms. Treaties, marriages, trade agreements, requests for help, family gossip. Everything travels folded inside handwritten pages. History's greatest dramas often begin with remarkably ordinary envelopes. The king reads, nods, sets the letter aside. Nothing urgent today. The household exhales almost without noticing. Work continues. Exactly as before. The fire still burns. The bread still bakes. The horses still eat. The castle keeps breathing through another perfectly ordinary morning. And perhaps that is the greatest surprise history offers us. The famous names remembered in textbooks: Edward, Louis, Philip, Henry, Eleanor, Isabella. They certainly shaped nations, but they also spent countless mornings exactly like this one, listening to bells, eating bread still warm from the oven, watching servants hurry through familiar routines, waiting for letters, wondering about the weather, feeling grateful that, for one more day at least, the hearth was warm, the roof remained mostly dry, and breakfast had arrived on time. Because before every famous decision, before every royal wedding, before every treaty that changed Europe, someone first sat quietly beside the fire and simply had breakfast. Breakfast has ended, not with applause, not with some dramatic announcement echoing through the great hall, just the familiar scrape of wooden benches, the quiet clink of cups being gathered, a servant carrying away another basket that, only a few minutes ago, held warm bread. The fire still burns steadily. It has settled into the dependable confidence of a hearth that knows it will be needed all day. Outside, the mist is beginning to lift. The castle walls emerge more clearly against the pale morning sky. Tiny drops of water still cling to ivy growing between old stones. A robin lands in the courtyard. It hops once, twice, looks around as though inspecting royal property. Apparently satisfied, it flies away without requesting an audience with the king, perhaps the wisest visitor of the morning. As the sun climbs higher, the castle becomes less like a home and more like a very busy office. Modern people often picture medieval rulers spending their days issuing grand commands from magnificent thrones. The truth was considerably less cinematic. Most mornings involved sitting, reading, listening, talking, then reading some more. Kingdoms, it turns out, generate paperwork almost as reliably as they generate taxes. A clerk enters the hall carrying several leather folders tied neatly with cord. He bows, places them before the steward. Inside are land records, rent collections, lists of repairs needed before winter, several requests from local villages, one complaint regarding wandering livestock. History quietly contains an astonishing number of wandering livestock. Someone's cow always seemed determined to become someone else's problem. The steward begins reading. Carefully. No one rushes. There is no advantage in rushing. A misunderstood number could mean ordering 50 sacks of grain instead of 15. That sort of mistake became memorable for all the wrong reasons. Nearby, another clerk sharpens a goose feather. Quill pens gradually wear down. Every few pages the tip needs trimming again. It is delicate work. Too much pressure and the feather splits. Too little and the ink refuses to behave. Modern pens ask remarkably little from us. Medieval writing demanded a small partnership between patience and craftsmanship. The clerk dips the newly shaped quill into a tiny pot of ink. One careful stroke across scrap parchment. Perfect. He smiles ever so slightly, not because anyone notices, simply because it feels satisfying when a tool behaves exactly as intended. There are thousands of little victories like this throughout history. Most remain unrecorded. Across the hall, the king begins hearing petitions. Ordinary people sometimes traveled remarkable distances hoping to present their concerns before the royal court. Not every request reached the king directly. Many stopped at local officials. But occasionally someone found themselves standing beneath towering rafters, speaking to the most powerful person in the kingdom. Imagine the nerves. Your boots still damp from muddy roads. Your cloak smelling faintly of rain. Your hands carefully gripping a folded document. Meanwhile, the king has already listened to 12 similar disputes this week. History often places extraordinary people into surprisingly ordinary routines. Today's first petitioner concerns a boundary dispute. Naturally, two neighboring estates disagree over where one field ends and another begins. The argument has apparently continued for years. Maps remain imprecise. Fences move. Trees fall. Streams slowly change course. Nature possesses very little respect for legal paperwork. The king listens. Questions are asked. Witnesses speak. Nothing particularly exciting happens. Eventually, a decision is recorded. Everyone bows. Life moves on. Modern documentaries rarely dedicate an entire episode to medieval property boundaries. Perhaps they should. These quiet decisions shaped daily life far more often than dramatic battles. Let's wander gently toward another corner of the castle. The tailor's workshop. Sunlight spills through narrow windows. Needles catch little flashes of light. Bundles of wool rest neatly beside folded linen. A young apprentice carefully measures a nobleman's sleeve. Again, then once more. Not because the nobleman keeps changing size. Simply because expensive cloth deserves accurate measurements. Fabric represented wealth. Fine wool required skilled workers. Silk traveled astonishing distances. Velvet remained a luxury. Nothing was wasted. Old garments became new garments. New garments eventually became children's clothing. Later they became patches. Finally they became cleaning cloths. Clothing enjoyed several lives before retirement. Fast fashion would have seemed utterly bewildering. The castle seamstress repairs a queen's favorite cloak. Not replacing it, repairing it. A tiny tear receives patient attention. Thread disappears into fabric almost invisibly. By the time she finishes, only someone looking very closely would notice anything had ever happened. Quiet craftsmanship like this surrounded medieval nobles every single day. They rarely made the history books, yet kingdoms depended upon skilled hands. Outside, sunshine finally reaches the herb garden. It is smaller than many people imagine. Still, it produces valuable plants. Sage, parsley, rosemary, mint, thyme. Medicinal herbs grow beside cooking herbs. The medieval distinction between food and medicine often proved wonderfully flexible. If something tasted pleasant and perhaps helped an upset stomach, so much the better. A gardener kneels among the beds. His fingers gently brush damp soil. He removes tiny weeds before they spread. Nobody praises him. Nobody writes songs about successful weeding. Yet everyone appreciates healthy herbs later. History quietly rewards consistent effort. A bee wanders lazily between flowering plants. The castle cat watches with great interest. Fortunately for the bee, cats rarely possess much enthusiasm for insects when sunshine offers an equally attractive place to nap. Further along the wall, two young pages practice sword movements. Slowly, very slowly. This isn't a tournament. It's repetition. One step forward. Raise the practice sword. Lower it again. Repeat. Their instructor corrects posture more often than speed. Balance first. Technique second. Strength eventually follows. One impatient boy swings too quickly. The wooden sword slips from his hands and lands in the grass. The instructor raises one eyebrow. No shouting. No humiliation. Simply another quiet lesson. Again. History often advances through countless gentle repetitions. Mastery rarely arrives dramatically. Nearby, an elderly knight watches with folded arms. His own fighting days mostly belong to memory now. A scar crosses one cheek. Another disappears beneath his beard. He has attended coronations, campaigns, royal weddings, funerals. Yet this peaceful mourning might please him just as much. There is comfort in watching young people learn while the kingdom enjoys a rare season of calm. Wars receive monuments. Peace receives ordinary mournings. Perhaps peace deserves more appreciation than history usually gives it. The chapel bell rings softly once more. Not urgently, simply marking another hour. Several servants quietly pause their work for prayer. Others continue kneading bread. The horses continue chewing hay. The ravens continue supervising absolutely everything from their favorite tower. Life flows around moments of worship rather than stopping entirely. Religion during the Middle Ages was not something reserved for special occasions. It formed the background rhythm of everyday existence, rather like the hearth itself, always present, always quietly influencing life. Let's drift for a while into the castle library. If library feels like too grand a word, think instead of a peaceful room containing precious books. Very precious books. Every volume has been copied by hand. Each page required careful work. Many books are chained to shelves, not because people expected thieves everywhere, simply because replacing a stolen manuscript might require months or even years. Knowledge possessed physical weight. It occupied shelves. It smelled faintly of leather. Turning a page carried a little more ceremony than tapping a screen. A monk visiting from a nearby abbey studies one manuscript carefully. His lips move silently while reading, quite common in the Middle Ages. Reading often remained an audible activity, even when done alone. Words felt connected to sound. Silence itself seemed almost incomplete without them. He copies a passage into his notebook, patiently, one line at a time. Outside the narrow window, clouds drift slowly across the blue sky. The rain has completely disappeared now. Sunlight warms the stone courtyard. Servants spread damp cloaks across wooden rails. Boots line up neatly outside the doorway. Leather slowly dries. Steam rises faintly where morning sunshine reaches soaked fabric. Yesterday's storm already feels distant. Weather passes. Routine remains. That may be one of history's quietest lessons. Kings change. Dynasties rise. Castles expand. Borders shift. Storms come and go. Yet someone always lights the fire. Someone always bakes bread. Someone always mends clothing. Someone always carries water from the well. The famous names rest upon countless ordinary lives. Without them, crowns become rather impractical objects. The sun now stands higher overhead. The great hall grows brighter. The shadows shrink. The morning's work continues with calm determination. A messenger saddles a fresh horse. The steward seals another letter with warm wax. The tailor finishes another careful stitch. The gardener fills another basket with herbs. The pages repeat the same sword movement one more time. The cook tastes tomorrow's broth. The clerk sands fresh ink so it dries neatly across the parchment. No single moment will appear in a textbook. Together, however, these moments become the heartbeat of medieval life. And as another log is gently placed upon the fire, sending fresh sparks dancing upward into the chimney, the castle settles comfortably into the long, peaceful rhythm of another ordinary day. The kind of day that happened thousands of times. The kind of day that quietly built history, one careful task at a time. The morning has slipped quietly into midday, almost without anyone noticing. The sunlight now reaches places that spent the entire morning wrapped in cool shadows. It stretches across the courtyard, climbs the outer walls, and warms patches of worn stone that have patiently waited since dawn. Tiny puddles left behind by yesterday's rain have nearly disappeared. Only a few damp corners remain beneath overhanging roofs where the sun struggles to reach. The hearth, however, still burns, a little smaller than before, not because it has become less important, simply because the day itself now lends a hand. Summer sunlight, even in northern Europe, could provide enough warmth that enormous roaring fires became unnecessary. The cooks still needed flames. The blacksmith certainly needed flames. But everyone else was grateful for a little less smoke drifting through the hall. The castle seems to breathe differently at midday. It becomes brighter, more relaxed. Even the ravens appear less serious, which admittedly is not saying very much. The great hall empties for a while. Not completely. It never truly stands empty. A few clerks remain bent over their writing. 2 servants quietly polish silver drinking cups. An elderly hound sleeps beside the fading fire, occasionally twitching one paw as though chasing imaginary rabbits through dream-filled forests. Nobody disturbs him. He has clearly earned the privilege. The king has moved to a smaller chamber where sunlight pours through narrow windows. Large halls looked impressive. Smaller rooms were considerably easier to keep warm, easier to hear conversations inside, and much more practical for conducting business. Not every royal decision required an audience of hundreds. Sometimes a king simply needed to discuss grain prices with 3 advisors. History enjoys reducing centuries into dramatic moments. Reality often involved lengthy conversations about supplies. Today's discussion concerns a bridge several miles away. Heavy rains have weakened part of its foundation. Merchants complain that wagons now cross one at a time. Farmers worry about transporting harvests later in the year. The royal treasurer quietly calculates repair costs. The steward estimates how many laborers might be needed. Nobody raises their voice. Nobody pounds a fist upon the table. The bridge simply needs fixing. Sometimes the greatest accomplishment of government is preventing tomorrow's inconvenience. Outside the chamber, a page waits patiently. He cannot hear much through the heavy oak door. He is perhaps 13 years old enough to understand responsibility, young enough to become distracted by a butterfly drifting across the courtyard. For several moments he watches it flutter between patches of lavender. Then he remembers he is supposed to appear serious. He straightens immediately. Fortunately, no one seems to have noticed. Or perhaps everyone remembers being 13. Nearby, the castle carpenter examines a long oak beam. One end has begun showing signs of rot. Rain, despite its usefulness for crops, possessed an unfortunate habit of encouraging wood to become something considerably less useful. The carpenter taps the beam with a small hammer, listens carefully, taps again. Experienced craftsmen often diagnosed problems by sound alone. A dull knock, a sharp echo, tiny differences invisible to everyone else. Knowledge gathered through decades rather than books. He quietly marks the damaged section with charcoal. It will be replaced before winter. Hopefully. Castles constantly required maintenance. Modern visitors often imagine them standing unchanged for centuries. The truth resembles an endless construction project. Roof tiles slipped, walls cracked, doors swelled during damp weather. Floors wore smooth beneath thousands of footsteps. Keeping a castle standing demanded continuous attention. Rather like caring for an elderly relative who insists everything is perfectly fine while simultaneously developing another mysterious creak every Tuesday. The kitchen has entered its busiest hours once again. Dinner, the largest meal of the day, requires careful preparation. Huge iron cauldrons hang over glowing coals. Steam curls upward, carrying comforting aromas of herbs and vegetables. One cook tastes a broth, adds another pinch of salt, tastes again. Satisfied, his apprentice watches closely. Recipes existed, certainly, but much depended upon judgment. How hot was today's fire? How fresh were today's vegetables? How salty was this particular barrel of preserved meat? Cooking remained wonderfully flexible. The head cook probably couldn't explain every decision. His hands simply knew. Nearby, loaves of bread cool upon wooden racks. Their crusts crackle softly as they settle. Fresh bread possesses a remarkable ability to improve almost any room. Even medieval accountants might have smiled a little more after passing the bakery. Well, perhaps not immediately. They were accountants, after all. But eventually, let's drift outside the castle walls for a gentle stroll. Just beyond the gate lies the village. The cottages cluster together like old friends sharing stories. Roofs of thatch dry slowly beneath the afternoon sun. Gardens overflow with beans, cabbage, onions, and herbs. Children chase one another around a well despite repeated instructions to stop running. Some instructions possess timeless qualities. A cooper shapes wooden barrels beneath a simple shelter. Each metal hoop slides carefully into place. Barrels mattered enormously. Ill-traveled inside them. Wine, salted fish, flour. Even important documents occasionally rode safely tucked inside wagons beside carefully stacked barrels. The cooper's hammer rises and falls with patient rhythm. Tap, turn, tap, turn again. Every strike feels measured, never hurried, not unlike history itself. Farther along the village lane, the blacksmith's forge glows bright against the daylight. Contrary to popular imagination, blacksmiths did not spend every waking moment producing swords. Most forged horseshoes, nails, door hinges, cooking hooks, plow parts, thousands of ordinary objects without which everyday life quietly collapsed. Swords looked magnificent. Nails held buildings together. One receives songs. The other receives almost no attention. Yet ask any medieval carpenter which mattered more. The answer might surprise you. The blacksmith wipes sweat from his forehead. Even on cool days, the forge remains astonishingly warm. His apprentice works the bellows. Slowly, steadily, fire brightens. Iron glows orange. The smith lifts the metal onto the anvil. Tap, tap, tap. Not furious pounding. Measured shaping. Each strike changes the metal just enough. Craftsmanship often resembles conversation more than conflict. Back inside the castle, Queen Eleanor strolls through a small enclosed garden. Gardens within castle walls served many purposes. Beauty certainly mattered, but practicality mattered even more. Medicinal herbs grew beside fragrant flowers. Apple trees offered shade. Rose bushes climbed wooden trellises. The queen pauses beside a bed of rosemary. She gently brushes one branch with her fingers. The scent fills the air immediately. Perhaps it reminds her of another castle, another season, another year. Even queens carried memories triggered by simple smells. History occasionally forgets that its famous figures possessed inner lives as ordinary as anyone else's. They worried about children, missed absent friends, wondered whether letters would arrive safely, hoped the weather would cooperate with harvests. A crown did not silence ordinary thoughts. In another corner of the garden, two ladies quietly embroider beneath a wooden arbor. Their conversation wanders comfortably from family news to fashions arriving from distant courts. One remarks that sleeves seem to be growing wider again. The other politely disagrees. Fashion debates have enjoyed extraordinary longevity. Centuries pass. People continue discussing sleeve sizes. Some things truly never change. Meanwhile, a young musician practices beneath an open window. His fingers move carefully across the strings of a small harp. He repeats the same melody several times. Each version grows smoother. Mistakes become smaller. Confidence grows quietly. No audience applauds. Practice rarely receives applause. Yet every beautiful performance begins with countless imperfect afternoons exactly like this one. The sun now stands high overhead. Warmth settles comfortably across the castle. Laundry hangs from long wooden poles stretched across the courtyard. White linen flutters gently in the breeze. Servants pause occasionally to turn heavy blankets so both sides dry evenly. There is something wonderfully peaceful about laundry drying beneath medieval towers. Not dramatic, not legendary, simply human. A pair of pigeons lands upon one of the walls. They coo softly while inspecting the courtyard below. One servant tosses a few crumbs toward them. The birds descend immediately. Optimism rewarded once again. Near the gatehouse, two guards share quiet conversation while polishing helmets. One speaks about his family in a nearby village. The other wonders whether this year's apple harvest will be good. Neither discusses glorious battles. Most soldiers spent far more time thinking about weather than warfare. Weather determined roads. Roads determined supplies. Supplies determined everything else. Clouds gather briefly on the western horizon. Everyone notices. Farmers glance upward. The gardener pauses. The stable master squints toward the distant hills. Then, just as quietly, the clouds drift away. No rain today. A small blessing. The carpenter smiles almost imperceptibly. Dry weather means repaired beams can remain outdoors a little longer. Tiny victories again. History is wonderfully full of them. The afternoon stretches lazily onward. The smell of fresh bread lingers. The forge continues ringing softly. Children laugh somewhere beyond the walls. The castle cat discovers a particularly warm patch of sunlight and immediately declares it personal property. Entire kingdoms have risen and fallen. Cats remain entirely unimpressed. The great bell rings once more. Its deep voice rolls across fields turning golden beneath the afternoon sun. Another hour has quietly passed. Another ordinary hour filled with repairs, conversations, careful craftsmanship, patient administration, and simple routines. Hours that almost never appear in history books. Yet without these peaceful afternoons, there would have been no castles to defend, no kingdoms to govern, and no stories left for us to tell centuries later. The sun continues its slow journey westward. The shadows lengthen almost too gradually to notice. Before long, the cooks will begin serving the evening meal. The hearth will brighten once more. The hall will fill with familiar faces. And another calm chapter in the endless rhythm of medieval life will quietly unfold beside the comforting crackle of the fire. The afternoon has begun its slow retreat. Sunlight still pours across the courtyard, but it has softened. The bright white glare of midday has become a warm golden glow that lingers on ancient stone as though reluctant to leave. Shadows stretch a little farther with every passing minute. The ravens have moved to their favorite perch on the western tower, where they seem to observe the entire castle with the calm confidence of birds who believe they have been supervising human affairs for centuries. Perhaps they have, at least from their perspective. The hearth, sensing that evening approaches, has grown stronger again. Fresh oak logs have been stacked carefully onto glowing coals. The fire answers with a pleasant crackle. Not loud enough to interrupt conversation, just enough to remind everyone that warmth is waiting. The kitchens have reached their busiest moment of the day. Hours of preparation are finally coming together. The head cook walks slowly between the fireplaces, inspecting every pot. One contains a thick barley stew. Another gently simmers with vegetables gathered from the castle gardens. Several spits turn steadily over open flames. Not because anyone enjoys standing beside intense heat for hours, simply because roasted meat refuses to cook itself. The apprentice responsible for turning one spit has developed a wonderfully distant expression. He has been watching meat rotate for nearly an hour. His thoughts have probably wandered to entirely different kingdoms by now. History rarely records daydreams. If it had, we might discover that medieval apprentices spent remarkably little time thinking about medieval apprenticeships. Nearby, a baker taps the bottom of a loaf. The hollow sound tells him everything he needs to know. Perfect. He sets it aside to cool beside dozens of others. Warm bread fills the room with a comforting smell that drifts through nearby corridors. Even people who have absolutely no intention of visiting the kitchen find themselves slowing their pace. Good bread has always possessed remarkable persuasive abilities. A young servant carefully arranges wooden trenchers upon long tables inside the great hall. Most are not plates in the modern sense. Instead, they are thick slices or boards of stale bread. Food will be served upon them. Once the meal ends, the soaked bread may be eaten, given to servants, offered to the poor, or fed to animals, depending upon local custom and circumstance. Very little goes to waste. Medieval households understood the value of resources with remarkable clarity. Waste represented tomorrow's hunger. That lesson required no explanation. The hall itself begins changing. Earlier it felt like a workplace. Now it slowly transforms into the center of evening life. Candles appear one after another, not because darkness has arrived, simply because daylight is already beginning its gentle farewell. Servants polish silver cups until they catch tiny reflections from the growing fire. Rushes covering sections of the floor are replaced where needed. Benches are straightened, tables wiped, everything prepared quietly. There is no frantic rush. The household has repeated this same routine countless evenings before. Practice has turned effort into habit. Let's wander toward the entrance. The gate opens. A small group of travelers arrives. Not strangers. Merchants expected several days earlier. Their wagons carry bolts of fine cloth from Flanders. Small bundles of spices. Carefully wrapped glassware. A chest filled with writing parchment. Nothing especially dramatic. Simply the steady flow of commerce that quietly connected medieval Europe. The merchants bow politely. The The steward greets them. Rooms will be arranged. The horses watered. Business discussed tomorrow. Tonight, everyone is simply grateful to arrive before sunset. Roads become considerably less welcoming after dark. Inside the hall, the king returns. So does the queen. Members of the household gradually gather according to rank. This ordering of people seems almost automatic. Everyone knows where to sit, who enters first, who waits, who serves. Years of custom require very few spoken instructions. Hierarchy has become muscle memory. The king offers a brief prayer. Heads bow. The room falls silent. Only the fire continues speaking. A gentle pop. A soft hiss as fresh sap inside one log meets growing heat. Then supper begins. Now, despite countless films showing endless banquets covered with peacocks wearing their feathers and improbable towers of pastries, most noble dinners remain surprisingly practical. Certainly, feast days existed. Coronations, royal weddings, Christmas, great celebrations. Those occasions displayed astonishing abundance. Tonight is different. This is an ordinary evening. A very pleasant ordinary evening. Stew is served. Fresh bread. Roasted chicken for the high table. Cheese. Apples gathered not long ago. Perhaps a little honey. Ale fills cups. Wine appears for those of higher status. Conversation gradually returns. Not everyone speaks loudly. Many simply enjoy the warmth after a day's work. A young page accidentally reaches for the wrong serving bowl. He freezes. The steward notices. For one uncomfortable heartbeat, the boy imagines every terrible consequence possible. The steward quietly moves the bowl to its proper place. Nothing more. The lesson has been delivered. Embarrassment proves entirely sufficient. The page exhales in relief. Growing up inside a royal household meant learning hundreds of tiny rules. Most were never written down. They simply existed. Like invisible furniture everyone somehow avoided bumping into. Across the table, an elderly noble begins telling a familiar hunting story. Everyone recognizes the opening sentence immediately. Several listeners smile politely. Others continue eating. The storyteller remains completely convinced that this version contains fascinating new details. It does not. History has always contained that one gentleman who can transform a short afternoon hunt into a 40-minute epic. Perhaps every family still has one. Nearby, Queen Eleanor asks after the health of one of the younger ladies serving in her household. The girl had caught a chill after last week's rain. Fortunately, she seems much improved. Simple kindness often disappears beneath the larger events of history. Yet letters and household records occasionally reveal surprisingly warm relationships between nobles and longtime servants. Nothing intended to overwhelm conversation. Just gentle melodies floating through the hall. The fire reflects from polished cups. Candlelight dances across carved beams high above. Smoke curls lazily toward the chimney. Outside, evening birds replace those of the afternoon. The rhythm of the day changes almost without anyone noticing. Let's drift gently beyond the walls once more. The village has entered its own evening. Farmers return from the fields. Oxen walk slowly home. Children proudly carry tiny bundles of sticks collected throughout the afternoon. Someone lights another cooking fire. Blue smoke rises into the cooling air. A woman needs tomorrow's bread. An old man repairs a fishing net outside his cottage. Neighbors exchange a few quiet words before everyone gradually disappears indoors. From here, the castle glows softly against the darkening sky. Not brightly. Candles simply cannot compete with modern electricity. Instead, warm golden windows appear like scattered stars resting upon stone. Travelers crossing distant hills would find comfort in that sight. Light meant shelter. Shelter meant food. Food meant another peaceful night. Back in the hall, dessert, if we may generously use the term, arrives. Fresh pears, walnuts, perhaps preserved cherries if the household has planned well. Nothing dripping with elaborate frosting. Sugar remains extraordinarily expensive. Sweetness itself remains a luxury. An apple dipped in honey can feel wonderfully extravagant. The king rises first. Everyone else follows. The formal meal has ended. Yet the evening has only just begun. Some remain in the hall. Others wander into smaller chambers. A few stroll through the courtyard enjoying the cool evening air. The fire continues burning faithfully. Two elderly knights settle beside it. Neither feels much need for conversation. Old friends often reach that comfortable stage. Silence itself becomes companionship. One occasionally pokes the fire with an iron rod. The other watches sparks drift upward. Neither seems in any hurry. History often celebrates ambition. It spends far less time appreciating contentment. Nearby, a grandmother tells three children an old story, perhaps about King Arthur. Perhaps about saints. Perhaps about a clever fox who outwitted a greedy wolf. The children already know the ending. They ask to hear it anyway. Familiar stories possess a special sort of comfort, rather like familiar songs, or the sound of rain upon stone, or the crackle of an old hearth after supper. Outside, the first stars begin appearing overhead. The sky deepens from blue to violet. The castle settles into another peaceful evening. Tomorrow will bring more letters, more bread, more repairs, more prayers, more conversations around the fire, more ordinary moments quietly passing beneath ancient timber beams. And those moments, repeated across countless evenings and countless generations, become the true rhythm of medieval life. Not the battles, not the coronations, not even the great treaties. The evening has grown deeper now. The fire has become the brightest thing in the room. Not because it is enormous, not because it is dramatic, simply because everything else has become quieter. The candles burn lower. The musicians have finished their melodies. The merchants who arrived earlier are settling into unfamiliar beds, listening to the strange sounds of a castle at night. A door closing somewhere in the distance. A guard walking along the walls. A horse shifting inside the stable. The soft movement of hundreds of people living together beneath one roof. A castle at night was never truly empty. It was simply quieter. And in this quiet, it becomes easier to remember something that history often forgets. The people living inside these walls were not just rulers. They were families, complicated families, very wealthy families, very powerful families, and, occasionally, very strange families, because behind every crown was a person, and behind every royal portrait was someone who had arguments, insecurities, habits, fears, and the occasional terrible decision that future generations would politely describe as politically complicated. Royal families often looked perfect from a distance. That was the point. Kings and queens were symbols. Their clothing represented wealth. Their ceremonies represented power. Their marriages represented alliances. Their children represented the future. But inside the castle walls, things were usually much messier. A royal family was still a family, and families have always been wonderfully talented at creating problems. Give any group of relatives enough time, money, and political importance, and eventually someone will argue about something. Piece of land, an inheritance, a marriage, who should sit where at dinner, who received the better room, who was treated unfairly 20 years ago. The medieval period simply added crowns to the situation, which naturally made everything much more complicated. A disagreement between ordinary siblings might affect a household. A disagreement between royal siblings could affect an entire kingdom. A small family argument could become a diplomatic crisis, because apparently medieval Europe believed family drama needed an audience of thousands. Let's return to the royal apartments. The king sits near a smaller fireplace. The room is comfortable by medieval standards. A tapestry hangs behind him. A wooden chest rests against the wall. A few books sit carefully on a table. A servant pours warm wine. The king is no longer conducting official business. For a brief moment, he is simply a tired person at the end of a long day. This is one of the most interesting contradictions of medieval royalty. The crown separated rulers from everyone else, but it also trapped them. A king could command armies. He could raise taxes. He could change laws. Yet he could not simply walk into a village market unnoticed and buy a loaf of bread. He could not easily escape expectations. Every conversation had meaning. Every friendship had possible political consequences. Every marriage involved strategy. Even affection could become complicated. Imagine living in a world where every person around you wondered whether they loved you or loved your position. That was the strange loneliness of power. Royal marriages were perhaps the clearest example. Today, people often imagine marriage as primarily a personal choice. During much of medieval history, royal marriage was closer to a political agreement. Families searched for useful connections. A princess might marry a foreign prince to create peace between kingdoms. A king might marry to secure an alliance. A child born from that marriage could become the reason two nations remained friendly for decades. Romance was sometimes present, but romance was not the main requirement. A successful royal marriage needed many things: good health, political usefulness, a reasonable temperament, and preferably a willingness to tolerate each other, a surprisingly important skill. Many royal couples managed this. Some became devoted partners. Others developed relationships that were polite, distant, or occasionally uncomfortable. Because even kings and queens could discover that sharing a life with another person was complicated. A crown did not provide instructions for emotional compatibility. Unfortunately, nobody included a manual with the throne. Let's gently drift toward one of history's most fascinating royal habits: keeping the family line pure. This idea appeared repeatedly among European elites. Noble families valued ancestry. They valued bloodlines. They valued the idea that certain families possessed special legitimacy because their ancestors had ruled before them. The problem was simple. Europe had a limited number of royal families, and those families kept marrying each other, again, and again, and again. At first, this seemed practical. A prince married a princess from another important house. Everyone celebrated. New alliances formed. The family tree expanded. Very elegant, very diplomatic. But after generations of the same small group of families exchanging marriages, the family tree began looking less like a tree and more like a carefully arranged garden where everyone was somehow related to everyone else. Eventually, historians would spend years studying royal genealogy charts that resemble complicated puzzles. Let's see. This king was his own cousin's cousin through 3 different connections. Because apparently medieval Europe looked at a small dating pool and decided to make it smaller. One of the most famous examples came much later with the Habsburg dynasty. The Habsburgs became one of Europe's most powerful royal families. They ruled enormous territories. They produced emperors and queens. They controlled lands stretching across much of Europe. Their influence was extraordinary. Their family strategy was also extraordinary. The famous saying associated with them was that they preferred marriage over warfare. Clever idea, peaceful idea, a successful idea. For a while, the Habsburg family expanded through careful marriages rather than constant conquest. But the same strategy created problems. Because when everyone in the family keeps marrying relatives, genetics eventually notices. And genetics, unlike a royal advisor, cannot be convinced through a persuasive speech. The famous example is King Charles II of Spain. His life was shaped by generations of close royal marriages. He suffered from severe health problems. His appearance reflected the genetic effects of repeated inbreeding. The famous Habsburg jaw became one of the most recognizable features associated with the dynasty. Portraits show a pronounced lower jaw and facial structure. Later generations would look at these paintings and realize that royal portraits were not always flattering artistic exaggerations. Sometimes they were simply recording reality. The king was born into enormous wealth and power. Yet his body struggled. It was one of history's saddest examples of how political decisions could affect personal lives. A dynasty focused on preserving a bloodline eventually weakened itself. A very human irony. But royal family difficulties were not limited to genetics. Personality mattered too. Some rulers inherited crowns before they were ready. A child could become king simply because his father died. Suddenly, a young person who still needed tutors and guidance was responsible for an entire country. Of course, advisors often helped. Usually, sometimes. Medieval politics was not exactly famous for everyone behaving responsibly. A young monarch could become surrounded by ambitious relatives. Nobles competed for influence. Different factions tried to control decisions. The child king became the center of a storm he barely understood. Imagine being 12 years old and discovering that every adult around you has strong opinions about your future. A little overwhelming. Most teenagers worry about homework. Royal teenagers worried about succession. The emotional pressure must have been extraordinary. Children in royal families also experienced unusual childhoods. They were loved. They were also trained. A prince was not simply a child. He was a future ruler. A princess was not simply a daughter. She could become the key to a diplomatic alliance. Their education included languages, religion, history, court manners, administration, sometimes military training. Every lesson carried expectations. A young prince practicing horseback riding was not merely enjoying an activity. He was preparing for a future role. A young princess learning embroidery was not only developing a skill. She was participating in the traditions expected of noble women. Although, thankfully, children remain children. A prince might still complain about boring lessons. A princess might still prefer playing with pets. Royal blood did not remove ordinary childhood emotions. The fire burns lower. The king has moved closer. The room has become warmer. A book rests open nearby. Perhaps he reads. Perhaps he simply thinks. The weight of a crown is often described metaphorically. But for medieval rulers, the weight was very real. Heavy metal, heavy jewels, heavy expectations. Every morning the crown waited. Every decision carried consequences. Every mistake became part of history. Ordinary people could make mistakes quietly. Kings made mistakes that historians studied centuries later. A forgotten argument, poor marriage decision, a careless financial choice, a moment of anger. All could become part of a dynasty story. Let's float over to another royal household. Because Europe's history is filled with families who were powerful, wealthy, and surprisingly imperfect. The Plantagenets, the Capetians, the Valois, the Habsburgs, the Tudors. Each dynasty carried its own collection of personalities. Some brilliant, some stubborn, some charming, some deeply difficult. Royal history is fascinating because these people were never simply symbols. They were humans trying to manage impossible situations. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Usually with excellent clothing and terrible timing. The castle grows quieter. The servants begin their final tasks. Candles are replaced. Doors checked. Fires prepared for the night. The royal family separates. Tomorrow will bring another day of decisions. Another day of responsibility. Another day where personal feelings must somehow exist alongside public duty. And as the rain begins lightly tapping against the stone walls once again, the castle returns to its familiar rhythm. The fire crackles. The shadows move. The crown rests quietly, waiting for morning, because behind every throne, behind every royal portrait, behind every name carved into history, there was simply a person, someone who woke up, someone who worried, someone who hoped, someone who sat beside a fire on a quiet evening and wondered what tomorrow might bring. The rain has returned, not heavily, just enough to remind everyone that medieval weather had a strong attachment to stone walls, muddy roads, and making clothing take several days longer to dry. The castle rests beneath a gray sky once again. Water slips down the towers. Tiny streams run between the courtyard stones. The world outside feels distant. Inside, the hearth continues its quiet duty. The flames rise and fall. The smoke curls upward. The warmth spreads slowly. And somewhere in the royal apartments, beneath layers of expensive fabric and surrounded by objects most people could never afford, a king wakes up with the same simple thought that has greeted humanity for thousands of years. I don't want to get out of bed yet, because beneath the crown, beneath the velvet, beneath the gold, Even kings occasionally wanted 5 more minutes. History simply forgot to mention that. Royal biographies often begin with achievements. The great king expanded his kingdom. The famous queen strengthened her dynasty. The emperor transformed Europe. All true. But before any of those things happened, these people first had to wake up. They had to get dressed. They had to eat. They had to deal with headaches, bad moods, uncomfortable clothing, and family members who were probably just as complicated as everyone else's. The difference was that their problems came with a much larger audience. A farmer arguing with his brother over a fence post affected a few people. A king arguing with his brother could affect an entire country. Same family problem, different consequences. A slightly more expensive argument. Let's stay beside the fire for a moment and consider the strange reality of medieval royalty. People imagined kings living in endless comfort. And compared with most people of their time, they certainly possessed enormous privileges. They had better food, better clothing, better homes, more servants, more opportunities. But luxury did not remove inconvenience. A castle could still be cold. A journey could still be miserable. A toothache could still ruin an entire week. And royal medicine was not exactly something anyone would recommend. A king suffering from illness did not suddenly gain access to modern hospitals, antibiotics, or comfortable treatments. Instead, he received the best medical knowledge available at the time. Unfortunately, the best medical knowledge of the Middle Ages sometimes involved ideas that sound strange today. Physicians studied carefully. They observed symptoms. They wrote books. They developed theories. But without modern science, many illnesses remained mysterious. A fever could become dangerous very quickly. A simple infection could become a serious threat. Even the wealthiest people in Europe remained vulnerable. Gold could buy many things, could not buy immunity. One fascinating example of royal vulnerability was the life of Edward II of England. Edward inherited the English throne in 1307. Unlike some of his more forceful predecessors, Edward had a personality that created endless conflict with powerful nobles. He enjoyed certain interests that did not always match the expectations of medieval kingship. He loved entertainment. He enjoyed manual activities. He had favorite companions. And unfortunately for him, medieval politics was not especially forgiving. A king was expected to behave like a symbol, a warrior, commander, a person who represented strength. Edward often seemed more interested in personal relationships and hobbies. Of course, being a king meant everyone had an opinion about how you should spend your time. Imagine your entire kingdom judging your hobbies. A little stressful. Edward's reign became filled with political struggles. Nobles challenged his decisions. His relationships became sources of controversy. His failures became exaggerated by enemies. Because history has always enjoyed adding extra drama to people who already had enough problems. Edward's story reminds us that a crown did not automatically provide leadership skills. A person could inherit a throne. They could not inherit wisdom. Unfortunately, wisdom remained one of those annoying things people usually had to develop themselves. Let's quietly move from England to France. The French monarchy produced many fascinating rulers. Some brilliant, some cautious, some surprisingly emotional. One of the most unusual was Charles VI of France, known as Charles the Mad. a title history gave him because apparently medieval historians did not believe in gentle descriptions. Charles became king at a young age. For much of his early reign, he appeared capable. He participated in government. He traveled. He led military campaigns. But later, he suffered from severe mental health problems that affected his ability to rule. His condition created enormous difficulties for the French court, because the question became painfully simple. What happens when the person wearing the crown cannot fully perform the responsibilities of the crown? The answer was complicated. Relatives competed for influence. Advisors struggled for control. The kingdom became divided. The king remained a symbol of authority, even when others made many decisions around him. It was a tragic situation, not because of dramatic battles, but because of a person struggling inside a role that demanded perfection. And perfection, unfortunately, is not a feature humans come with. Royal families also faced another challenge: expectation. From childhood, princes and princesses were surrounded by people telling them who they were supposed to become. Prince should be brave. Prince should command. Prince should marry strategically. A princess should represent elegance. A princess should create alliances. Every action carried meaning. A simple childhood mistake could become a political concern. A stubborn personality could become a future crisis. Parents throughout history have worried about their children. Royal parents simply worried while knowing thousands of people were watching. A little pressure, just a little. Let's drift toward Spain, a kingdom of enormous importance, a land of powerful monarchs, a place where royal family decisions would eventually shape world history. The Spanish monarchy produced perhaps the most famous example of dynastic problems. Charles II of Spain, born in 1661, the final Habsburg ruler of Spain. His life has fascinated historians for centuries. From childhood, Charles experienced serious health difficulties. His physical condition was fragile. His upbringing was extremely sheltered. At the time, however, people did not understand the science behind it. They simply witnessed the consequences. A dynasty built around preserving itself slowly discovered that isolation had costs. The tragedy of Charles II was not only personal. It affected the future of Spain. Because when a king has no surviving heir, the question of succession becomes enormous. And European powers immediately begin paying attention. Because, naturally, nothing attracts international interest quite like a wealthy kingdom with an uncertain future. But let's return to the warmth of the hearth. Because despite these famous examples, most royal days were not filled with disasters. They were filled with routine. A queen choosing fabric colors. A prince practicing handwriting. A king reviewing accounts. A servant delivering messages. A cook preparing dinner. A musician practicing the same melody for the 10th time. History often focuses on moments when everything changed. But life was mostly the long stretches between those moments. The quiet mornings. The ordinary evenings. The conversations nobody recorded. The small decisions nobody celebrated. Those were the moments that created the world. A young noble child sits near the fireplace tonight. Perhaps he is learning his letters. Perhaps he is supposed to be studying. Perhaps he is secretly watching a dog sleeping nearby instead. Children remain children. No amount of royal importance changes that. He does not know yet what role history might give him. He does not know whether he will become a great ruler, a forgotten ruler, a controversial ruler, or simply someone whose name appears in a genealogy book centuries later. Tonight, he is just a child beside a warm fire. And that is enough. The candles burn lower. The rain continues outside. The castle settles once again into its nighttime rhythm. A guard walks the walls. A servant checks the doors. The kitchen prepares for tomorrow. The horses rest. The royal family disappears behind heavy curtains. Another day has passed. A day without great battles. A day without dramatic ceremonies. A day filled with small responsibilities and quiet struggles. Because the real story of medieval royalty was not only about crowns. It was about people trying to carry them. Some carried them gracefully. Some struggled. Some made mistakes. Some became legends. Others became warnings. But all of them at some point sat beside a fire. All of them listened to rain against stone. All of them experienced ordinary moments hidden beneath extraordinary titles. And as the final embers glow softly in the darkness, the castle prepares to sleep. Tomorrow will bring another morning, another set of problems, another collection of decisions, another day in the endless story of kings, queens, and the very human lives behind their golden crowns. The fire is quieter tonight, not weaker, just older. The flames have settled into that comfortable rhythm that comes after many hours of burning. The largest logs have already become glowing pieces of coal, and every so often one small flame rises again, reaching upward before gently disappearing. Outside, the castle sits beneath a dark sky. The rain has stopped. The wind has slowed. The world beyond the walls feels distant and almost unreal. Inside, everything returns to the familiar sounds of evening. A servant walking softly across stone. A door closing somewhere in the distance. A horse moving inside the stable. A page turning in a book. And, of course, the hearth. Always the hearth. The one thing in the castle that never cared who wore the crown. Kings came and went. Dynasties rose and disappeared. Families argued over inheritance and power. The fire simply continued burning. Tonight, let's drift deeper into one of the strangest parts of royal history, the family tree. At first glance, royal family trees look impressive. Long lines of names, generations of rulers, marriages connecting kingdoms, children becoming heirs. It appears organized, almost elegant, but after a few centuries, things become complicated, very complicated. Eventually, royal genealogy starts looking less like a beautiful tree and more like a tangled collection of vines that someone forgot to trim for several hundred years. And somewhere inside those vines, a historian is sitting with a piece of paper, quietly whispering, "Wait. So this person is their own cousin through 3 different connections?" Because apparently medieval and early modern Europe enjoyed making family relationships as confusing as possible. The reason was simple: power. Royal families believed marriage could strengthen kingdoms. A marriage could create peace between former enemies, could bring new territories, could secure alliances, could prevent wars. In theory, it was brilliant. Instead of fighting your neighbor, marry their daughter. Instead of invading a kingdom, connect your families. It was diplomacy wearing expensive clothing. And for a while it worked. But there was a problem. There were only so many royal families. Europe's kings and queens kept looking around for suitable partners and discovering that everyone important was already connected. The same families appeared again and again. A princess from one kingdom married a prince from another. Their child married another royal relative. Their grandchild repeated the process. The family connections became tighter. The circle became smaller. And eventually, the royal marriage market started feeling less like a huge continent and more like a very exclusive village where everyone knew everyone. A village with crowns and slightly more complicated paperwork. The Habsburg dynasty provides perhaps the most famous example. The Habsburgs were extraordinarily successful. They built one of the most powerful royal houses in European history. Their rulers became emperors. They controlled vast territories. Their influence stretched across Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and lands far beyond. Their motto was often summarized by the phrase, "Let others wage war. You happy Austria, Mary." The idea was simple. Other rulers gained territory through armies. The Habsburgs gained influence through marriages. And honestly, it was an impressive strategy. Why spend years fighting when a carefully arranged wedding could accomplish the same goal? The problem came later, because every strategy has limits. And the Habsburg strategy involved a family tree that increasingly folded back onto itself. The same bloodlines repeated. The same ancestors appeared multiple times. Generation after generation. The dynasty became powerful, but it also became fragile. Let's visit Spain for a quiet moment. Not during war. Not during a political crisis. Just a palace evening. The Spanish court is filled with ceremony. Beautiful clothing, formal conversations, carefully arranged appearances. The monarchy represents greatness, but behind the scenes there is concern. The royal family line has become increasingly complicated. Charles II of Spain sits at the center of this story. Born into one of the most powerful positions in Europe, he inherited enormous expectations. Everyone hoped he would continue the dynasty. Everyone hoped he would produce an heir. But his health problems made his life difficult. He struggled physically from a young age. His body carried the consequences of generations of close family marriages. At the time, nobody understood genetics. They did not know about DNA. They did not understand inherited conditions in the way we do today. They simply saw a king who suffered. A king surrounded by doctors who had limited answers. A king living inside a system that had placed enormous importance on ancestry. The irony was painful. A dynasty had spent centuries protecting its bloodline. Eventually, that same protection weakened the dynasty. But royal family problems were not only about genetics. Sometimes they were about personality. Because even perfect health could not guarantee a peaceful household. Royal courts were filled with ambition. A younger brother might desire more influence. A cousin might believe he deserved a title. A queen's relatives might seek positions at court. A king's closest friends might become controversial. Family members were not only relatives. They were political figures. Every relationship had another layer. A brother was a brother, but he might also be a possible rival. A cousin was a cousin, but he might also have a claim to the throne. A marriage was a marriage, but it was also an international agreement. Imagine trying to have a normal family dinner where everyone knows the seating arrangement could affect the future of a kingdom. A little stressful. Let's gently move to England. The Plantagenets were famous for producing strong personalities. They created some of England's most memorable rulers. But they also created family conflicts that seemed almost impossible to avoid. King Henry II and his sons are a perfect example. Henry II was an energetic ruler, intelligent, organized, ambitious. He built royal authority and expanded English power. But his family life was complicated. His sons were ambitious too. Unfortunately, they inherited their father's determination without always inheriting his patience. A dangerous combination. The result was repeated conflict. Family disagreements became political struggles. Arguments became rebellions. A father's relationship with his sons became a matter of national importance. It is difficult enough when a teenager argues with a parent. Imagine if that teenager also commanded armies. Suddenly, family therapy sounds like a very reasonable invention. Royal children often carried enormous expectations. From the moment they were born, their futures were discussed. A newborn prince was not simply a baby. He was an heir. A newborn princess was not simply a child. She was a possible alliance. Their lives belonged partly to themselves and partly to the dynasty. This could create strange childhoods. Royal children often had many servants but limited freedom. They were surrounded by people yet could feel isolated. They received excellent education but lived under constant pressure. A prince might learn languages, law, and warfare. A princess might learn court etiquette, administration, and diplomacy. Their lessons were not only about knowledge. They were preparation. The entire kingdom was waiting to see what kind of person they would become. One of the most fascinating things about royal history is how ordinary emotions survived inside extraordinary situations. A prince could still feel nervous. A queen could still feel lonely. A king could still miss his childhood home. A princess could still worry about an arranged marriage. The crown changed circumstances. It did not change human nature. People still wanted approval. People still feared failure. People still hoped to be loved. A royal portrait may show confidence. The person behind it may have felt very different. The fire pops softly. A spark rises, then disappears, much like generations of royal families. One generation burns brightly. Another takes its place. Another follows. Names change. Borders change. Titles change. But the same human patterns repeat. Ambition, love, jealousy, pride, fear, hope. History is full of kings and queens who believed they were creating something permanent. Yet even the greatest dynasties eventually became chapters in a book. As the night grows deeper, let's imagine a royal archive. A quiet room, shelves filled with documents, genealogies carefully written, names connected by lines of ink. A monk or clerk studies the records. He traces one family connection, then another. He pauses. He checks again. The family tree has become surprisingly complicated. Perhaps even the person who created it needed a moment. A deep breath, a little patience, maybe a cup of warm ale. Because following medieval royal marriages could become an exhausting profession. Tomorrow the castle will continue. The kitchen fires will return. The bells will ring. Letters will arrive. The royal family will continue managing its endless responsibilities. But tonight, beneath the quiet glow of the hearth, we remember something important. Royal families were not magical. They were not perfect. They were simply people placed inside enormous systems. Their choices shaped countries. Their mistakes shaped history. Their marriages shaped continents. Their family problems became historical events. And yet, at the end of every long day, they returned to the same simple things. A warm room, a quiet fire, a little rest, because even the most powerful families in history eventually had to put aside their crowns and go to sleep. The night is calm, the kind of calm that arrives only after a very long day. The castle has grown familiar with darkness now. The corridors are quiet. The great hall is almost empty. The candles have become smaller, their flames trembling gently as the wax slowly disappears. The hearth remains. It always remains. A few glowing embers sit beneath a layer of ash, still holding onto their warmth as though refusing to admit that the day is ending. Outside, the stars appear above the towers. The same stars that watched medieval kings walk beneath them. The same stars that watched queens write letters. Princes dream of futures they would never see, and servants hurry through courtyards carrying buckets of water. Centuries have passed. The stones remain. The sky remains. The quiet moments remain. When we think about medieval royalty, we often imagine the grand moments. The coronations, the battles, the magnificent weddings, the ceremonies filled with gold, music, and thousands of people. Those moments certainly existed, but they were rare. Most royal life happened somewhere else, in smaller rooms, during ordinary mornings, during quiet evenings beside fireplaces, between the important events. A king could spend months preparing for one major decision. A queen could spend years managing a household. A prince could spend a childhood learning skills he might never use. History remembers the destination. It often forgets the long road that led there. And that road was filled with ordinary days. Let's return once more to the world of royal families, because their greatest challenge was often not enemies outside the kingdom. It was the simple problem of continuing. Every dynasty had one great concern: the future. Who would inherit the throne? Who would continue the family name? Who would carry the crown after them? Succession was the quiet question behind almost everything. A marriage was not only about two people. It was about possible children. A child's health was not only personal. It was political. A royal birth could create celebration across a kingdom. A royal death could create uncertainty. The future always sat beside the throne, sometimes patiently, sometimes uncomfortably close. One of the most fascinating examples is the Tudor dynasty. Unlike older royal families, the Tudors were relatively new rulers when they came to power. They understood something important. A king needed more than authority. He needed legitimacy. He needed people to believe his family belonged on the throne. This created enormous pressure. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, worked carefully to strengthen his position. His son, Henry VIII, became one of England's most famous monarchs. Today, people remember Henry VIII for his enormous personality, his 6 marriages, his dramatic political changes, his larger-than-life reputation. But beneath the famous stories was a simple concern shared by many rulers: an heir, a son, a future. The Tudor dynasty depended on succession, and Henry VIII wanted certainty. Unfortunately, history rarely provides certainty. It enjoys complications far too much. Henry's personal life became deeply connected to politics. His marriages were not simply private relationships. They affected the entire country. A queen's ability to produce an heir became a matter of national importance. A royal household could become focused on one question: will there be a child? The emotional pressure must have been enormous, because behind all the political discussions were real people, people experiencing hope, disappointment, fear, loss. Royal life often turned private emotions into public events. A family moment could become a national crisis. Let's gently move away from England and travel toward another royal court. The French monarchy. For centuries, French kings lived within a system built around tradition. The palace represented continuity. The crown represented stability. The royal family represented the future. Yet even the strongest traditions could not prevent change. Every dynasty eventually faced uncertainty. A ruler might have no heir. A child might inherit too young. A family might divide over succession. The same patterns appeared again and again. Different names, different countries, similar problems. History has a tendency to repeat itself with slightly different costumes. One of the quieter tragedies of royal history is how many rulers never experienced ordinary freedom. A king could not simply decide to disappear for a day. A queen could not easily escape ceremony. Their lives were constantly observed. Every gesture could be interpreted. Every friendship could become political. Every choice could create rumors. Modern celebrities sometimes describe feeling watched. Royal families understood that feeling long before cameras existed. Their audience was not millions of strangers online. It was entire kingdoms. Yet, despite all these pressures, royal households were also filled with moments of warmth. A mother holding a child near the fire. A father teaching a son to ride. A queen laughing with companions. A king sharing a joke after dinner. These moments rarely appear in official records, but they existed because power does not remove tenderness. A crown does not stop someone from caring. Title does not erase affection. Human emotions survive almost everywhere, even inside palaces. The castle library is quiet tonight. A few manuscripts rest on wooden shelves. Among them are records of births and deaths, marriage agreements, royal letters, carefully preserved histories. Someone hundreds of years later will read these documents and try to understand the people who created them. They will study dates. They will study politics. They will study wars. But perhaps the most interesting discoveries come from the small details. A king requesting a favorite food. A queen mentioning a beloved pet. A child practicing handwriting. A servant receiving a reward for loyal service. These tiny pieces reveal something important. The people of the past were not simply characters in a story. They were living people. Let's sit beside the fire one more time. Imagine the final evening of a medieval ruler. Not a dramatic ending. Not a battlefield. Just a quiet room. A familiar chair. A familiar fireplace. The same sounds they have heard thousands of times. The crackling wood. The footsteps outside. The distant bells. Perhaps they think about their life. the decisions they made, the people they loved, the mistakes they regret, the things they never managed to complete, because eventually every ruler discovers the same truth. A crown lasts longer than a person. The title continues. The individual does not. The greatest castles in Europe still stand today. Their walls have survived storms, wars, political changes, centuries of silence. Visitors walk through them now. They admire the architecture, the towers, the halls, the beautiful decorations. But beneath those stones are memories of ordinary moments. A servant carrying firewood, a child laughing, a cook preparing dinner, a musician practicing alone, a tired ruler resting after a long day. The castle was never only a monument. It was a home, a complicated, expensive, drafty home, but a home nonetheless. The fire grows smaller. The last large flame disappears. Only embers remain, red points of light beneath gray ash. Tomorrow morning someone will return. Someone will carefully uncover them. Someone will add fresh wood. Someone will breathe life into the fire again. And another day will begin. This simple action connects us to the past. The people who lived centuries ago woke up. They worked. They worried. They rested. Just as people do today. Their world looked different. Their clothing was different. Their technology was different. But their experiences were surprisingly familiar. They wanted comfort. They wanted security. They wanted their families to be safe. They wanted their lives to matter. So tonight, as the castle settles into silence, we leave behind the golden halls and complicated family trees. We leave behind the arguments over succession, the political marriages, the fragile dynasties, the kings who carried impossible expectations, the queens who managed impossible households, the children born into impossible futures. And we return to the simplest image: a fire, a room, quiet night, a person resting after another long day. Because perhaps that is the most human part of history. Not the crowns, not the titles, not the monuments, but the ordinary moments hidden beneath them. The moments when everyone, no matter their rank, simply sat near the warmth and listened to the world becoming quiet. The rain begins again, softly, almost like a whisper. The castle walls hold steady. The candles disappear. The hearth finally rests. And somewhere in the darkness, another page of history quietly turns. The fire is almost gone now. Not completely. A few glowing embers still remain beneath the soft layer of ash. They shine quietly in the darkness. Small reminders that even the strongest flames eventually become something gentler. Outside, the rain falls once again. A familiar sound, patient sound, the kind of rain that seems to have existed forever. It taps against the old stone walls. It slides down the towers. It gathers in the courtyard. And inside the castle, everyone sleeps. The king, the queen, the servants, the guards, the cooks who will wake before dawn, the stable workers who will feed the horses before most people have opened their eyes, the scribes who will return to their parchment, the children who will continue growing into futures they cannot yet imagine. Another night, another quiet ending. When we look back at medieval history, it is easy to focus only on the people at the top. The kings with their crowns, the queens with their jewels, the emperors with their enormous titles. Their names appear in books. Their portraits hang in museums. Their decisions are studied centuries later. But kingdoms were never built by rulers alone. A castle was not kept alive by a crown. It was kept alive by thousands of small actions. Someone carried water. Someone repaired a roof. Someone planted vegetables. Someone sharpened tools. Someone cooked meals. Someone copied books. Someone cleaned rooms that nobody remembers. These people rarely entered official histories, but they were the heartbeat of the medieval world. A medieval castle was not just a fortress. It was a small universe, a place where hundreds of lives crossed paths. The noble family at the center, the servants who kept everything moving, the craftsmen who repaired what broke, the merchants who brought distant goods, the farmers who provided food, the guards who watched through cold nights, the children who played in courtyards. Everyone had a role. Everyone contributed something. Even the person whose job seemed insignificant was part of a much larger story. A single missing task could affect many others. A broken wagon will delay supplies. A failed harvest created worry. A damaged roof threatened everyone beneath it. A poorly managed fire could make winter unbearable. The medieval world depended on cooperation. Not perfect cooperation. Humans have never been especially talented at that. But enough cooperation to keep going. Let's return once more to the royal family. The people who seem to have everything. Gold, power, land, influence. Yet their lives carried their own difficulties. A king could command armies but still worry about his children. A queen could wear magnificent clothing but still fear illness. A prince could inherit a throne but also inherit enormous pressure. A princess could represent an alliance while wondering what her own future would feel like. The crown gave privilege. It also gave responsibility. And responsibility has always been a heavy thing to carry. Perhaps that is why so many royal stories feel strangely familiar. Because behind all the ceremonies were people dealing with very human problems. Family disagreements, loneliness, fear, ambition, love, regret. The clothing changed. The castles changed. The emotions did not. The dynasties we remember today often seem almost unreal. The Plantagenets, the Tudors, the Habsburgs, the Capetians, names that sound like they belong to legends, but they were families. They celebrated births. They mourned deaths. They argued at dinner. They worried about money. They complained about the weather. They became sick. They grew old. They made mistakes. They hoped their children would do better. The same hopes that have followed families through every century. The story of royal marriages is perhaps one of the clearest examples of history's strange sense of irony. Marriage was used as a tool of diplomacy, a way to create peace, a way to connect nations, a way to strengthen dynasties, and sometimes it worked brilliantly, but sometimes the same strategy created unexpected problems. Families became too connected. The search for a perfect bloodline created weakness. The attempt to preserve power slowly changed the very families trying to protect it. History often contains these quiet contradictions. People make decisions that seem logical in their own time. Only later do the consequences become clear. The people of the past were not foolish. They simply lived without the knowledge we have today. They made choices based on the world they understood. And that is something every generation does. The final candle in the great hall flickers. The flame moves slightly as a cold breeze enters through a small gap in the stonework. A servant notices. He closes the shutter. Another tiny problem solved. Another tiny task completed. Tomorrow, nobody will remember this moment. No historian will write. On this particular evening, a servant successfully prevented a small draft from entering the great hall. And yet, that moment mattered, because history is not only made by famous decisions. It is made by countless small ones. The door that was repaired, the meal that was prepared, the letter that was delivered, the child who was taught, the fire that was kept alive. Imagine walking through this castle centuries later. The halls are quiet. The people are gone. The voices have disappeared. The fireplaces no longer warm the rooms. The footsteps have faded, but the stones remain. You walk beneath the same arches. You touch the same walls. You stand where kings once stood. And perhaps the most interesting thought is not that powerful people lived here. It is that ordinary people lived here too. Thousands of them. People whose names disappeared. People who never expected to be remembered. People who still shaped history. A young servant wakes briefly during the night. The fire has become cooler. He adds another piece of wood. Just one. Enough to keep the embers alive until morning. He does not know that this tiny action connects him to generations before and after him. For thousands of years, humans have gathered around fire. Fire has been warmth, food, safety, company, place where stories are told, place where people rest, place where memories are created. The medieval hearth was more than a source of heat. It was the center of life. The morning will come soon. The same morning that has come after every night before. The rooster will announce it loudly. The bells will ring. The kitchens will wake. The castle will move again. Someone will complain about the weather. Someone will search for missing tools. Someone will hurry because they are late. Someone will laugh. Someone will tell an old story for the 100th time. And the world will continue. Slowly, quietly, ordinarily. So tonight, as we leave this old castle behind, remember the image we began with. A rainy evening, a crackling hearth, a room filled with shadows and warm light. A world that moved much slower than ours. A world where news traveled by horse, where books were copied by hand, where castles stood above villages, where kings carried crowns, where servants carried firewood, where everyone, regardless of status, searched for the same simple things. Warmth, safety, companionship, place to belong. The last embers fade. The rain continues. The castle sleeps. And somewhere beneath layers of stone and centuries of history, the memory of those ordinary lives remains. Not in golden statues, not only in royal portraits, but in the quiet details, the worn steps, the faded tapestries, the marks left by countless hands. The fireplaces that once warmed entire generations. The rooms where people laughed, worried, dreamed, and rested. Because history is not only the story of those who ruled. It is the story of everyone who lived, everyone who worked, everyone who loved, everyone who woke up each morning and quietly continued. And perhaps that is the most comforting thought of all, that beneath every crown was a person, Beneath every castle was a community, and beneath every grand chapter of history, there was simply another ordinary day, another fire, another evening, another human story. The rain grows softer, the hearth grows darker, the night settles completely, and the long, slow journey through this forgotten world finally comes to an end.